kings burned alive in their own beds, emperors stabbed by siblings, queens who took 3 strikes to be beheaded. This isn't Game of Thrones. This is real history, uglier, bloodier, and stranger than fiction. Across 5 continents and 3,000 years, we've gathered the 49 most brutal royal deaths ever recorded. Not just the how, but the why. This is the crown at its most cursed, the throne when it turns into a trap. Welcome to the end of kings. This is the 49 most brutal royal deaths in history. Before we dive into the downfall of empires, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another dive into the darkest corners of history. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because whether it's midnight in Manila or breakfast in Berlin, you've just stepped into a royal bloodbath. Let's begin. Ramesses III, Egypt, c. 1155 BCE, throat cut in the harem conspiracy, confirmed by CT scans. At first glance, Ramesses III had it all: a throne wrapped in gold, gods whispering his name, and a legacy built on the bones of invaders. But ancient Egypt had a habit of biting its pharaohs back. And for Ramesses, the jaws came from within his own harem. His reign looked strong on paper. He crushed enemies, built monuments, played the divine king role to perfection. But behind the curtain, in the fragrant gilded shadows of his palace, the real danger brewed. It wasn't the foreign armies that got him. It was domestic betrayal. And not just any betrayal, a Shakespearean conspiracy orchestrated by his own wife. Meet Ta, one of many wives, but not the top dog. That title belonged to another queen whose son was in line for the throne. Ta wanted the crown for her own son, Pentawere. So she did what any sensible palace conspirator in 1155 BCE would do. She assembled a team: servants, magicians, officials, even scribes, all roped in to flip the future of Egypt. What followed was one of the most sophisticated inside jobs in pharaonic history, the infamous harem conspiracy. For years, historians only had papyrus scrolls to go on trial transcripts, confessions scratched in ink, accusations thick with political paranoia. The plotters were caught, tortured, tried, and condemned. Pentawere was allowed to take his own life, likely forced. Justice, in ancient Egypt, was just vengeance wrapped in ceremony. But here's the kicker. For centuries, nobody could confirm whether the assassination worked. The ancient records danced around the death itself. Some believed Ramesses III survived the plot and died later, peacefully. That is, until 2012. Enter CT scans and modern science. Ramesses' mummy had been wrapped up nice and neat, face intact, no visible trauma. But the scans told another story. Underneath the linen, a deep slash across his throat clean through to the spine. A cut so massive it nearly decapitated him, hidden for 3,000 years. The conspiracy worked. The pharaoh didn't just die, he was silently butchered in a palace where trust was a myth, his last breath stolen not by war or disease, but by the ambitions of a woman scorned and a son denied. And yet, even in death, Ramesses left behind a twisted legacy. His murder is the oldest known political assassination with forensic evidence, the kind of royal whodunit that makes you double-check your security detail 3,000 years later. Because if a god-king could be taken out by pillow talk and ambition, what hope did the rest of them have? Just ask the next guy who got an axe to the head. Several, actually. Seqenenre Tao II Egypt, c. 1550 BCE. Multiple weapon blows to the head. likely executed after capture, shown by CT. Seqenenre Tao II had one of those names that rolls off the tongue like a threat. He ruled southern Egypt during a time when the country was split, and the Hyksos, a foreign dynasty, controlled the north. Tensions ran high. Borders were shaky. Diplomacy was a joke. And then came the insult. According to ancient records, the Hyksos king sent Seqenenre a message complaining about noisy hippos near Thebes, hundreds of miles away, an obvious taunt, a political middle finger. Seqenenre had a choice: ignore it or fight. He chose war. What happened next is a mystery written in blood and CT data. Seqenenre disappears from the historical narrative, only to reappear centuries later in a Cairo museum, wrapped in rough linens, smelling faintly of embalming resin and royal vengeance. His mummy was discovered in 1881, and it looked bad. Really bad. Head smashed, jaw broken, cheek split, skull fractured like dry clay. But what made this case legendary wasn't just the damage, it was the silence. No embalming incisions, no proper mummification, just a rush job. For decades, Egyptologists debated, did he fall in battle? Was he assassinated in his sleep? Or was it something worse? The answer came thousands of years later, when modern scans peered past the dried flesh. The wounds were deliberate, focused, precise, delivered by different weapons from multiple directions. Axe, dagger, club, all at head level, and here's the brutal clincher: there were no defensive wounds. That means Seqenenre wasn't swinging back. He was on his knees, tied up, executed like a prisoner. Imagine it. The king of Thebes, bloodied and bound, forced to kneel before his enemies. A war axe arcs through the air, then another, and another, until the king's skull is a map of hatred. They didn't just kill him, they made an example out of his face. But here's the twist: his death lit the fuse. His sons rose in rebellion, and one of them, Ahmose I, would eventually crush the Hyksos and reunite Egypt. Seqenenre didn't live to see it, but his mangled corpse became the martyr that forged an empire. Because sometimes a shattered skull is the seed of a dynasty. Just like what happens when an emperor gets turned into a literal footrest. Emperor Valerian Rome, 260 CE, captured by Shapur I. Later writers claim he was used as a footstool and died in degrading captivity, details disputed. By the 3rd century, Rome wasn't just burning, it was hemorrhaging emperors. Enter Valerian, a man with silver in his beard and big dreams of restoring Roman glory. Instead, he got humiliation carved into history. It started with Persia, Rome's eternal pain in the east. The Sassanid king Shapur I had been poking at Rome's borders, and Valerian had had enough. He marched east, confident, armored, flanked by legions. Then everything fell apart. The Battle of Edessa was a disaster. Roman forces crumbled. Valerian, Emperor of Rome, the so-called restorer of the world, was captured alive. That's right, alive. A living, breathing Roman emperor in enemy hands. From here, the story forks into legend and speculation. According to Roman sources written years later by people very angry, Shapur didn't just imprison Valerian. He humiliated him, used him as a human stepping stool to mount his horse, day after day. The ultimate imperial flex. When Shapur got bored, they say he had Valerian skinned and stuffed, his corpse displayed as a warning to every Roman diplomat who dared to dream. Gruesome. Absolutely. True? Maybe. Persian sources are suspiciously quiet on the matter. Some scholars think the worst parts were Roman propaganda. But even if half of it's true, it's still one of the most brutal downfalls in royal history. Valerian started as the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth and ended as either a literal footrest or a prisoner rotting in a Persian backroom. His failure shook Rome to its core. It was the first and last time a Roman emperor was taken captive alive, a humiliation so deep it echoed for centuries. And it set the stage for the next royal fall, a caliph rolled up in a rug, waiting for the horses. Caliph Al-Musta'sim, Abbasids 1258, rolled up in a carpet and trampled by horses after Baghdad fell to the Mongols. In the year 1258, Baghdad was the center of the Islamic world. It was a city of learning, of poetry, of palaces that glittered like gold filigree under the desert Sunday. It was the home of the Abbasid Caliphate, an empire that had once stretched across continents, and in the heart of it all sat Caliph Al-Musta'sim, the 37th and final ruler of his line. He ruled with tradition, not with strength. Where his ancestors commanded armies, he preferred scholars. Where his empire cried out for defense, he sent letters. And where there should have been walls and war preparations, there was only hope that the Mongols wouldn't come. But the Mongols came. Tughluq Khan, grandson of Genghis, had been sent west with one mission: obliterate resistance. He wasn't playing chess, he was flipping the board. And when he reached Baghdad, he found a city unready, a caliphate splintered by inaction. Al-Musta'sim hesitated until the gates of Baghdad were choked with horsemen. He still believed, perhaps, that diplomacy or faith or lineage would save him, but Mongol diplomacy was written in fire and ash. The siege began, and within weeks, the city was in ruins. The sack of Baghdad was one of the most catastrophic events in medieval history. Libraries burned. The Tigris reportedly ran black with ink and red with blood. The city that had once been the jewel of the Islamic Golden Age became a scorched shadow of itself. And in the middle of it all was Al-Musta'sim. Captured alive, his fate was never going to be simple. The Mongols, known for their superstition, believed that royal blood should not touch the earth. So they devised a method of execution that was both symbolically humiliating and practically brutal. They rolled the caliph into a rug, thick, tight, like he was some forgotten treasure, and then they rode their horses over him until he moved no more. Whether that's fully accurate is debatable, but the symbolism stuck. The last caliph of Baghdad snuffed out not with a sword, but with a hoof. Not in a battlefield blaze, but in an insult disguised as execution. His death marked more than the fall of a man, it marked the end of an age. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the brain and beating heart of the Islamic world, dissolved into memory. Baghdad, that ancient metropolis, would never regain its former glory. The Mongols moved on. Tughluq continued west. The Islamic world reeled, and the world itself had lost something irreplaceable. The sense that some cities, some rulers, were simply too sacred to fall. And if Baghdad, the seat of a millennium, could be flattened into dust, imagine what could happen to a Byzantine emperor dragged through the streets by his own people. Andronikos I, Byzantium, 1185. Lynched by a Constantinople mob over hours, beaten, mutilated, and killed. Byzantium had always done death with flair, poisonings, palace coups, blinding, betrayals set to organ music. But even by imperial standards, the fall of Andronikos I Komnenos stands out, a slow-motion implosion dragged through the gutters of Constantinople. His story begins as a comeback tale. Once a rogue noble, imprisoned, exiled, rumoured dead, Andronikos returned to the empire in his 60s. With charisma, cunning and a flair for rebellion, he overthrew the regents of the young emperor and seized power for himself. At first, he was hailed as a reformer. He tackled corruption, checked the power of aristocrats, championed the poor. But his reforms came soaked in paranoia. His regime darkened into a surveillance state. Accusations of treason were met with swift, merciless punishments. Executions skyrocketed. Fear settled like fog over the capital. He grew increasingly erratic, his rule a blend of populist showmanship and violent crackdowns. Aristocrats vanished. Rivals were mutilated. Even the church turned wary. Then came the final spark. He arranged the marriage of his teenage heir to a 1-2-year-old princess. The people winced, but what broke them was something else, entirely an invasion. The Normans from Sicily stormed into Byzantine territory. Panic surged. Rumors spread that Andronikos had sold out the empire. Whether true or not didn't matter. The people of Constantinople, battered and betrayed, had found their scapegoat. What followed was not an execution, it was an eruption. The mob found him trying to flee in disguise. He was dragged into the capital, a broken man wrapped in royal shame. Over hours, they beat him, cut him, mocked him. He was paraded through the streets like a grotesque carnival exhibit, tied between two mutilated animals. They shoved things into his mouth. They gouged at his eyes. The violence was public, intimate, and relentless. He died slowly, too slowly. The city made sure of it. No trial, no official sentence, just the raw, unfiltered wrath of a city that had turned on its emperor with the force of an earthquake. Andronikos had ruled as if he were immortal, but Constantinople reminded him, and everyone watching, that even emperors are just meat in silk robes when the crowd decides they've had enough. And that crowd didn't stop there. The next emperor didn't last long either. He got thrown off a column like yesterday's garbage. Alexios V. Ducas, Byzantium, 1204, blinded, then hurled from a column by the victors after the Fourth Crusade. Alexios V. Ducas, also known as Mortzuflos, yes, that was his nickname, thanks to his bushy eyebrows, had a brief and blood-soaked cameo in Byzantine tragedy. His reign lasted only a few months, but he managed to squeeze in enough betrayal and chaos to get himself immortalized in infamy. He came to power in the twilight of the empire, as the Fourth Crusade loomed over Constantinople like a curse. The Crusaders, originally on their way to the Holy Land, had been diverted, somehow bribed, somehow tricked, somehow enraged into sacking one of Christendom's greatest cities instead. The Byzantine throne had been in musical chairs mode for decades. Alexios IV and his blind father, Isaac II, were recently installed co-emperors thanks to the Crusaders. But promises made to Western mercenaries turned sour. Debts weren't paid, tensions boiled, and from that boiling pot, Mortzuflos emerged. He staged a palace coup, executed Alexios IV. Isaac II died soon after, and for a heartbeat, Mortzuflos was emperor. But his timing was catastrophic. The Crusaders were already at the gates, and his attempts to fight them off while more spirited than his predecessors were not enough. In April 1204, Constantinople fell, not with dignity, but with fire and looting and an orgy of destruction that made the city a hollowed-out corpse. Alexios V fled, but he didn't get far. Eventually, he was captured by the new Latin rulers of the city people he'd tried and failed to repel, and they had a very medieval sense of justice. First, they blinded him, a typical punishment for overreaching emperors. Then, in a final act of contempt, they marched him up to the top of the column of Theodosius, a towering stone relic of old imperial glory. And then, they threw him off. The symbolism was brutal. Here's a man who clawed his way to the top through murder, now falling through the air like a broken lie. From emperor to pavement in one sickening drop. He had ruled for 120 days. He died in under 10 seconds. And with him went another chunk of Byzantium's collapsing dignity. But that empire still had plenty of brutal exits left to offer, including one emperor who thought he was safe until his starving enemies locked him in a cistern. Basiliscus, Byzantium, 476, promised safety, then exiled and starved to death with his family in a cistern. Basiliscus was never supposed to be emperor, not by blood, not by destiny, and certainly not by popular demand. He was a military man, a power player in the Byzantine court, and the brother of the Empress Verena, who happened to be the widow of Emperor Leo I. That connection gave him ambition, the kind that whispers in your ear at night and convinces you that stealing a throne is the same thing as earning it. In 475, with the reigning emperor Zeno temporarily driven from Constantinople by a revolt, Basiliscus did what any uncle with imperial daydreams and a handful of troops might do. He declared himself Augustus. For a while, it looked like he might pull it off. He had the support of the Senate, the church, and key military commanders. The city didn't erupt in flames. No mobs protested in the streets. The transition felt oddly smooth. And that should have been the first red flag. Because Basiliscus wasn't loved, he was tolerated. And in the Byzantine Empire, being tolerated was just the first stage of being destroyed. His reign lasted about 20 months, and in that time, he managed to alienate almost every major faction in the capital. His religious policies were divisive, especially his leanings toward monophysitism at a time when theology was less a debate and more a powder keg. His financial policies were worse, lavish spending, heavy taxation, corruption on fast forward. Even the weather seemed to hate him. A fire broke out in Constantinople during his reign, and many took it as a sign. Meanwhile, Zeno wasn't gone. He was regrouping. When Zeno returned from exile with an army at his back, Basiliscus panicked. He tried diplomacy. He sent envoys. He offered safe passage. Then, in a final act of desperation, he fled with his wife and son, seeking sanctuary in a church. It didn't work. Zeno, playing the emperor's favorite game, I swear I won't hurt you, personally promised Basiliscus that no harm would come to him or his family, the kind of lie that empires are built on. Basiliscus surrendered, and instead of exile or execution, Zeno gave him something worse, obscurity with a timer. He had Basiliscus, his wife, and his son locked in a dry cistern somewhere in Cappadocia. No food, no contact, no second chance. They died slowly, in the dark, with only silence and each other for company. It was the imperial equivalent of being erased from the hard drive, not just death, but deletion. And here's the irony. Basiliscus had once led a failed naval campaign against the Vandals that nearly shattered the empire's eastern fleet. People thought his incompetence would doom Rome from the outside. Instead, it was his ambition that broke him from within. His death wasn't bloody. It wasn't public. It didn't make the crowds cheer. But in its quiet cruelty, it spoke volumes about the Byzantine system. No oath was sacred, and no fall too deep. Because the next emperor thought even the church was safe until he got hacked down at Christmas in front of the altar. Leo V, the Armenian, Byzantium, 820. Hacked down by conspirators during Christmas services inside Hagia Sophia. Leo V didn't get a peaceful start to his reign, and he certainly didn't get a peaceful end. The man was born into obscurity, rose through the ranks of the military, and seized power in a coup that ousted his childhood friend and former co-ruler, Michael Irangabi. That friendship would eventually come full circle, just not in the way Leo expected. Leo ruled during one of the great Byzantine obsessions, iconoclasm, the debate over whether religious icons should be venerated or destroyed. Think less of a spiritual squabble, more of a cultural cage match. Leo was an iconoclast. He believed the use of religious images was heretical, and he wasn't shy about enforcing his views. This wasn't a new argument in Byzantium, but Leo brought it back with force. He removed icons from churches, punished iconophiles, and reignited a controversy that had already torn through the empire once before. And in doing so, he picked a fight not just with monks and theologians, but with the soul of his capital. But Leo's fall wouldn't come from religious fanatics. It came from someone closer. Someone who knew his schedule, knew his habits, knew that on Christmas Eve, the emperor always attended services in Hagia Sophia. Michael the Amorian was a former ally, a one-time general, and now, due to a recent falling out, a political prisoner. Leo suspected him of plotting against him, and for good reason. He was. But Leo, ever the legalist, insisted on a trial. So Michael was imprisoned in a dark cell, chained, awaiting judgment. And yet, despite being locked up, Michael managed to orchestrate Leo's death. On Christmas morning in 820, Leo arrived at Hagia Sophia for the holiday liturgy. The space was grand, the air heavy with incense, and somewhere among the sacred echoes of the choir, men with swords waited. They struck during the service. No warning, no hesitation. The emperor was attacked in front of the altar, surrounded by priests and icons he'd tried to destroy. It was brutal, but quick. He fought back with a wooden cross. That detail alone is almost too perfect, an emperor who banned icons dying with one in his hands. And as his blood cooled on the marble, the conspirators ran to the prison where Michael was held. They dressed him in imperial robes and proclaimed him emperor on the spot. The chains were still fresh on his wrists when he took the throne. Leo's body was left behind in the church, a final statement in an empire that didn't believe in soft landings. The Byzantine throne didn't just shift, it lurched. From childhood friend to betrayed emperor to a corpse beneath golden mosaics. But what happens when the empire turns on someone slower, blinder, and far more tragic? Next, a ruler who lost not just his throne, but his eyes, and died from the wounds. Romanos IV, Diogenes Byzantium, 1072, captured, brutally blinded. Died soon after from his wounds. Romanos IV Diogenes was a soldier first, an emperor second, and a scapegoat always. He came to power in the middle of a Byzantine identity crisis. The army was weakened, the aristocracy was bloated, and the Seljuk Turks were pressing harder at the borders with every passing month. Romanos, a tall, battle-hardened noble, married into the imperial family and took up the purple with a singular goal: fix the military. His moment of truth came in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert. He led the Byzantine forces personally against the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan. It was supposed to be a defining victory. Instead, it was one of the worst disasters in Byzantine military history. Romanos was captured. His army shattered. The eastern provinces crumbled, and while he was treated honorably in captivity paroled, even his throne was already gone. Back in Constantinople, his enemies didn't wait. The Ducas family, who'd always resented him, declared him deposed. When Romanos returned, expecting at least a fig leaf of negotiation, he got open rebellion. He tried to fight. He lost. He surrendered. And the punishment was as political as it was physical. They blinded him, not just symbolically, but fatally. The act was done so poorly, with so little care, that he became infected. The wound never healed. He was exiled to a monastery, eyes bandaged, dignity in tatters. Within weeks, the infection consumed him. He died not in a palace, not in the arms of family, but alone, in pain, on some forgotten island monastery, an emperor, unmade by the very empire he tried to defend. His reign lasted only a few years, but the consequences of his defeat at Manzikert would echo for centuries. Anatolia, the empire's heartland, would never be fully regained. The Turks moved in, and Byzantium began a slow bleed from which it never truly recovered. Romanos became a warning that even loyalty, strength, and battlefield courage weren't enough to protect a man from palace politics, especially when the next emperor was a child who got torn from his throne and blinded by his own mother. Constantine VI, Byzantium 797, seized and blinded on his mother Irene's orders, died not long after. The empire once called him Porphyrogenetos, born in the purple. Constantine VI was the legitimate heir to the Byzantine throne, the son of Emperor Leo IV and Empress Irene. He was born into royalty, raised for rulership, and crowned co-emperor, while still swaddled in ceremonial silk. Everything about his early life pointed to power. But power in Byzantium was never inherited easily. It had to be held with clenched fists and sleepless eyes. When Leo IV died in 780, Constantine was only 9. His mother Irene stepped in as regent, ruling with sharp intellect and sharper ambition. She restored icon veneration, improved the empire's image, and charmed the church, but always in her own name, not her son's. Constantine was kept in the background, paraded as a symbol, but not allowed to lead. And as he grew older, it became clear Irene didn't plan to step aside. By the time he turned 16, Constantine tried to push her out. What followed was a palace struggle stretched across 2 decades, a silent war of mother versus son. Irene refused to let go. Constantine, unprepared and increasingly unpopular, kept stumbling. His military campaigns failed. His political decisions alienated the aristocracy. His marriage decisions enraged the church. Each mistake drove more people back into Irene's camp. The final blow came in 797. Constantine had tried to assert himself too forcefully. Irene, sensing her grip weakening, struck first. She lured him into a false sense of safety, some say with letters, others with open arms. Then, in a stunning act of dynastic betrayal, she had him seized. Her own son. Her orders were cold, calculated. Blind him, remove the threat permanently. Not with poison, not with exile, just enough pain to make ruling impossible. Constantine didn't survive the ordeal. He died shortly after, likely from complications, though the details are lost in the folds of imperial silence. The empire never announced it. Irene simply took the throne alone, the first woman to rule Byzantium in her own right. And here's the chilling part. She styled herself as Basileus, the masculine form of emperor. Not Basilissa. Not empress. Emperor. The church didn't stop her. The court bowed. Even the foreign powers, shocked as they were, accepted her as the ruler of Rome's eastern half. But her reign wouldn't last. The West crowned Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor in 800, declaring that the Roman Empire in the East, now ruled by a woman, had lost its legitimacy. Irene's blinding of Constantine had made her powerful but also isolated. She was eventually deposed in a palace coup and exiled. She died in obscurity. Her son died in the shadows of his own palace. Eyes stolen, crown lost. He wasn't the first emperor to fall to internal betrayal. But he might be the only one whose fall came at the hands of the person who once kissed his scraped knees. And yet, even that wasn't the empire's low point. Because before Irene's power grab, there was another emperor dragged from his throne and slaughtered beside his sons on the edge of a cold sea. Maurice, Byzantium, 602, deposed and executed alongside his sons on the shore at Chalcedon. Maurice was an emperor who did everything by the book, a career soldier, a practical strategist, a frugal administrator. He fought Persia to a standstill, defended the Balkans from Slavs, and kept the treasury in the black. He didn't throw banquets or build giant palaces, he built stability, and that's what doomed him. The people of Constantinople didn't want stability. They wanted relief. The tax burden was high. The wars were endless. The city simmered. Maurice's refusal to overspend or surrender too much made him look more like a bureaucrat than a ruler. Then came the military revolt. It started on the Danube frontier, where Maurice ordered his troops to winter beyond the river to save money. The soldiers mutinied. They declared one of their generals, Phocas, as emperor. The insurrection marched toward Constantinople, and the capital, always eager for a change, swung open the gates. Maurice fled with his family. He had sons, heirs, boys who still laughed and ran and played with wooden swords. He took them across the Bosporus to Chalcedon, hoping to regroup. But there was no regrouping. Phocas captured him. Captured the boys. And in one of the coldest executions in Byzantine history, Maurice and his sons were murdered on the shore, one by one, forced to watch each other fall. Maurice, once the master of the empire, died not in battle, not in rebellion, but in helplessness, watching his legacy vanish with every strike. His death was not just the end of a man, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Phocas's reign would go down as one of the bloodiest, most chaotic, and least competent in imperial history. The Persian king, horrified by Maurice's death, used it as a pretext to invade. The empire descended into near collapse. Maurice's memory, once tarnished, became sanctified. Even the church declared him a martyr. But in that moment on the shore, he was just a father. Powerless, watching the future die in front of him. And if that wasn't enough of a fall from grace, what about the emperor who got dragged through the streets, tossed into a river, and written out of Roman history? Elagabalus, Rome, 222, murdered by his guards. Body dragged through streets and thrown into the Tiber. Elagabalus wasn't just a Roman emperor. He was a performance, a controversy in human form, a teenager wrapped in silk, drenched in perfume, and crowned in a world that wanted nothing but order and decorum. Born in Syria and installed on the throne through the political maneuvering of his grandmother, Julia Maesa, Elagabalus came to power at the age of 14. His rule was a jolt of colour to a Rome that preferred its emperors in grayscale. He brought with him his religion worship of the sun god Elagabal, whom he considered supreme over Jupiter, Mars, and all the Roman pantheon. He built temples, he performed rituals that scandalized the Senate. He tried to force the Roman elite to accept foreign gods, foreign customs, foreign everything. Rome, the empire of discipline, did not approve. But it wasn't just religion. Elagabalus ruled as if the imperial dignity was a joke. His court was a circus of eccentricity. His behavior shocked even the jaded elite of a society used to excess. He ignored Roman tradition, dismissed the Senate, surrounded himself with favorites and flatterers. At first, the Praetorian Guard tolerated him, but the longer he ruled, the thinner their patience wore. The final straw came when he began favouring his young cousin, Severus Alexander, and hinted at making him heir. The guard made their move in 222. They turned on him suddenly, without warning. Elagabalus and his mother were taken by surprise, no allies, no escape plan. They were killed quickly, efficiently, but the story doesn't end there. Elagabalus's body was desecrated, dragged through the streets of Rome, mocked, dumped into the Tiber River like trash. A message to the public: this emperor never existed. This never happened. Official portraits were destroyed, names erased from monuments. It was as close as Rome could get to deleting a file from history. But the memory lingered, not as a ruler, but as a cautionary tale. Elagabalus didn't fall in battle. He didn't face a barbarian army or a rival general. He fell because Rome couldn't stomach his difference. And when Rome couldn't stomach something, it spit it out with boots and river water. The throne would move on. The empire would pretend to forget. But not every emperor died as a scandal. Some died just doing their job and got beaten to death by the very men they commanded. Probus, Rome, 282. Beaten to death by mutinous soldiers amid public works they hated. Marcus Aurelius Probus was a soldier's emperor. Not in name only, he'd clawed his way up through the ranks, winning battles on nearly every frontier Rome had to offer. Germans, Vandals, Egyptians, Gauls. He crushed them all. He was disciplined, decisive, and, in his prime, almost universally respected by the legions. But power is a strange beast. It doesn't just test your strength, it tests your timing. Probus came to the throne during a moment when Rome was limping from crisis to crisis. The 3rd century had become a carousel of emperors, coups, and constant war. And while most rulers clung to the sword to maintain order, Probus had a different vision. Peace. It sounds noble, but peace, for Roman soldiers, often meant boredom. And boredom, in an empire built on conquest, was dangerous. So Probus found them a new purpose: drain swamps, build roads, plant vineyards. Yes, vineyards. To Probus, the legions were more than killers. They were Rome's muscle, capable of restoring infrastructure, not just tearing through it. But to the hardened veterans, this sounded like punishment. They hadn't signed up to haul bricks or dig canals. They were warriors, not labourers. It didn't help that Probus refused to indulge them with the luxuries other emperors handed out: no massive pay raises, no pointless campaigns just to loot a few towns. He ran the empire like a general, not a politician. Efficient, fair, impersonal. And so the grumbling began. In 282, while he was in Sirmium, his hometown in modern-day Serbia, something snapped. A group of soldiers, already disillusioned, already fuming, learned that Probus had supposedly selected a successor without consulting them. The rumor was enough. They turned on him. The mutiny was fast, furious. Probus, the man who had once led them into battle, was now a target. The very soldiers he trusted, trained, and tried to civilize attacked him. The exact circumstances are hazy, no grand speeches, no drawn-out battle. Just raw discontent unleashed on the emperor who thought peace was a reward, not a threat. They beat him to death. No ceremony. No exile. Just fists and fury, perhaps tools meant for vineyards used instead for vengeance. The man who once said, if only it were possible for the empire to need no soldiers, died proving that Rome wasn't ready for that world. His successor, Carus, returned to the traditional model: war, glory, and short reigns. The fields Probus dreamed of never bloomed. The roads remained half-built. The emperor who tried to heal Rome with hard work instead of conquest was buried by the very hands he hoped to retrain. And while Probus died in a flurry of misplaced loyalty, the next sultan on our list never had a chance to earn loyalty at all, because by the time he tried, The Janissaries were already tightening the cord. Osman II Ottoman, 1622, deposed teen sultan, strangled by Janissaries at Yedikuli fortress. Osman II came to power as a teenager, 16 years old, lean and sharp-eyed, with a mind that moved faster than most of his advisors could track. He was an Ottoman sultan who actually wanted to rule, not just pose for miniatures and issue decrees written by others, and that alone made him dangerous. From the start, Osman was different. He spoke multiple languages, he wrote poetry, he took direct control of state affairs. And when war called against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, he didn't send generals. He led the campaign himself. But the war didn't go well. His army, bloated with unmotivated troops and plagued by supply issues, stumbled into failure. Osman blamed one group in particular, the Janissaries. The Janissaries were elite soldiers, a corps built from Christian boys taken through the Devshirme system and converted to Islam. Over time, they had become powerful, political, and notoriously hard to control. Think less loyal guard, more armed union with swords. Osman despised them. He saw them as corrupt, lazy, and insubordinate. So he did what no sultan before him had dared. He plotted to replace them. His plan was radical. Disband the Janissaries. Replace them with a new army, drawn from Anatolia, loyal only to him, modernized, disciplined, independent from palace intrigue. It might have worked if he hadn't underestimated the Janissaries' reach. Word of his intentions leaked, and once it did, it spread through the capital like fire through dry brush. The Janissaries erupted in revolt. They stormed the palace. Clerics, bureaucrats, and even common citizens were swept into the chaos. Osman tried to suppress it. He ordered executions, made speeches, tried to rally support, but he was young, alone, and the army he needed didn't exist yet. The rebellion crested. He was captured, dragged from power, and imprisoned in Yedikuli Fortress, the Tower of Seven Towers, a place that sounded like a fairy tale but functioned more like a mausoleum. And then came the final betrayal. The Janissaries didn't just imprison Osman, they decided to remove him permanently. The story goes that they strangled him, perhaps with a bowstring, the traditional method. Some say it was clumsy. Others say it was coldly efficient. He was just 18. Osman II became the first Ottoman sultan to be killed by his own troops. His death shocked the empire. Even hardened officials were rattled. Because if a sultan descended from conquerors, guarded by prophecy, surrounded by walls, could be killed in a fortress in the middle of his own capital, then what was sacred anymore? The Janissaries had proven their power, and Osman had proven, in death, that vision without control is a dangerous luxury. But if you think one sultan's fall was dramatic, wait until his cousin's turn. He didn't get strangled for plotting change. He got killed for simply losing control. Selim III, Ottoman, 1808, deposed and stabbed to death during the Janissary revolt. Selim III was born into empire, raised among marble courtyards, educated by the best minds of his era, and crowned with the heavy expectation of dragging the Ottoman Empire into modernity. He was a poet, a reformer, a dreamer in a palace full of realists, and that, in the end, was the problem. When Selim took the throne in 1789, the Ottoman world was already groaning under centuries of slow decay. The military was outdated, the administration bloated, the borders porous. Europe had moved into a new gear, and the Ottomans were still using old maps. Selim saw it all clearly, and he wasn't content to preserve the past. He wanted to fix it. He launched a program known as the Nizam as-Sadid, the New Order, new army, new taxes, new administration, Western-style uniforms, European instructors, French-style military drills. The works. The reaction was mixed. The intellectuals applauded. Some provincial governors hesitated. The Janissaries, however, went ballistic. The reforms threatened their status, their privileges, their very identity. Selim was trying to build a future that didn't include them. And the Janissaries, ever the institutional survivors, decided to remind the empire who really held the keys. They revolted in 1807, not a clean military coup, but a messy, city-wide upheaval. They stormed the capital, demanded Selim's abdication. He was forced to step down. His cousin Mustafa IV was placed on the throne, more pliable, less threatening. But the Janissaries weren't satisfied with just removal. They feared Selim could return, especially with supporters still maneuvering behind the scenes. So they decided to remove the possibility altogether. In 1808, when loyalist forces tried to restore Selim, it was too late. Selim, unarmed and already deposed, was cornered in his chambers. He was killed in the palace he once ruled, not in a dramatic battle, not in some faraway exile, but in the gilded space where he once planned an empire's rebirth. The symbolism was sharp. A man who had tried to bring Europe's enlightenment into Ottoman corridors met the sharp resistance of tradition, wielded like a dagger. Selim's death marked the end of the first serious reform wave in the Ottoman Empire. His killers thought they had preserved the old order, but within a year, a new Sultan Mahmud II would begin exacting revenge. And eventually, even the Janissaries themselves would be purged, violently and permanently. But in 1808, Selim was just another dreamer, left bleeding in the ruins of his own ambition. And he wasn't even the most fragile of them. That honor might belong to his predecessor, a man so erratic he earned the nickname the Mad, and whose end was just as suffocating. Ibrahim the Mad, Ottoman, 1648, strangled by bowstring after deposition. Ibrahim. I didn't start mad. He was made that way slowly, steadily, and in the most Ottoman way possible. Isolation. For the first 23 years of his life, Ibrahim lived in a cage. Not a literal one, but something just as cruel. The cafes was a secluded part of the imperial palace, a golden prison where princes were locked away to prevent any chance of civil war. No responsibilities, no freedom, no windows into the world beyond the walls. It was like being buried alive in velvet. By the time Ibrahim became Sultan in 1640, after the death of his brother Murad IV, he was psychologically hollow. The palace guards had to break down the door to his chambers to tell him he was emperor. He thought it was a trap, and in a way, he was right. Ibrahim emerged from the cafes not as a ruler, but as a vessel of confusion, paranoia, and craving. His early reign was handled by his mother, Kusum Sultan, an iron-willed power broker who'd kept the Ottoman machine running through the reigns of her sons. For a while, she managed him, shielded him, ran things in his name while keeping him distracted with pleasure and pageantry. But you can't padlock madness forever. As Ibrahim grew bolder, his erratic behavior spilled into state affairs. He appointed favorites with no merit, lavished enormous wealth on court companions, launched naval expeditions on whims. His obsessions consumed policy at one point. He poured resources into collecting furs from across the empire, convinced they healed his ailments. Entire provinces bled silver for a sultan's fantasy wardrobe. And then there were the executions. Ministers, officials, even women from the harem. Anyone who displeased him or whom he imagined might betray him was swiftly removed. The empire could tolerate eccentricity, but erratic violence? Not so much. By 1648, the Janissaries and court elites had had enough. A palace coup was launched with the backing of religious leaders. The people, too, had turned. The empire was in crisis. War debts, economic collapse, open unrest. Ibrahim was deposed and imprisoned in the same palace he'd once feared to enter. For a brief moment, it looked like he might be spared. His young son, Mehmed IV, was crowned. There was even talk of letting Ibrahim live out his days in quiet confinement, but the danger was too great. He still had supporters. He could still be a rallying point for revolt. So the order was given. A bowstring was brought traditional, silent. 2 executioners did the job quickly, efficiently, in the name of empire and stability. Ibrahim's body was laid to rest without ceremony. Another casualty of the Ottoman throne, where one misstep could turn a cage into a grave. His reign lasted 8 years. His legacy? A warning, etched into the empire's memory, that no prison creates a ruler, and no throne can save a mind unfit to wear a crown. But if you think strangulation was rough, just wait until the next Ottoman prince one raised to lead was marched into his father's tent and given no chance to run at all. Şehzade Mustafa, Ottoman 1553, strangled in his father Suleiman's campaign tent before the army. Mustafa was born to rule. He was the eldest son of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the architect of the Ottoman Golden Age. The empire was at its height, politically, culturally, territorially. And in that world of conquest and diplomacy, Mustafa shone bright. He was charismatic, intelligent, a natural leader, beloved by the army, adored by the people. He wasn't just the heir apparent, he was the kind of prince who made the future look secure, and that made him dangerous. The Ottomans had no fixed law of succession. When a sultan died, his sons fought for the throne, sometimes literally. In theory, this kept the strongest prince on top. In practice, it bred paranoia. Suleiman, for all his brilliance, was still a father navigating treacherous palace waters. His favoured wife, Hurrem Sultan, once a concubine, now queen, had sons of her own. And while court whispers are notoriously slippery, rumours swirled that she and her allies wanted Mustafa out of the picture. The idea of a coup began to fester, that Mustafa was plotting to take the throne before his father died, that he had the army's loyalty, that he might act first. Whether those rumours were true or fabricated by court politics, Suleiman believed them. In 1553, while on campaign in Persia, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent. The setting wasn't accidental. A military camp, a public space, a gesture that seemed like reconciliation or perhaps a final test. Mustafa entered, dressed in royal garb, likely confused but obedient. Outside, the army watched. Whispers drifted like smoke. Inside the tent, the mood changed quickly. Attendants leapt forward, bowstrings tightened. The prince, once moments from an empire, struggled briefly and was gone. Just like that. No trial, no testimony. Just a calculated execution, sanctioned by the Sultan, carried out with precision. The soldiers outside were stunned. Many had loved Mustafa. Some wept openly, others cursed quietly, but no one challenged the Sultan. Not then. Mustafa's death shook the empire, not because a prince had died, but because the wrong one had. The one who could have carried the empire into a second golden age, the one with military support, the one who had done nothing at least provably wrong. His body was buried with ceremony. The empire mourned publicly, but the damage lingered beneath the surface. Suleiman would go on to reign for another decade, but he was never the same. He had sacrificed not just a son, but a future. And as for succession, it would never be secure again. The Ottoman tradition of fratricide would continue, brothers killing brothers, sons executed at the whisper of dissent, because when ambition meets fear on a battlefield, even blood ties dissolve in a tent. And yet, in a different corner of the empire, one last sultan stood defiant until the gates of Cairo turned into his gallows. Tuman Bay II, Mamluk Egypt, 1517, publicly hanged from Cairo's Bab Zuwayla Gate by the Ottomans. Tuman Bay II was the last Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, and he ruled like a man who didn't know his story was already over. He came to power in 1516 during a storm. The Ottomans, under Sultan Selim I, were sweeping across the Middle East. The Mamluk Sultanate, once a juggernaut of Islamic power, was cracking under the pressure. Tuman Bey was young, energetic, brave. He hadn't asked for the throne, but when it fell to him, he gripped it with both hands. He tried diplomacy. He tried war. He tried to do what centuries of Mamluk leaders had done, defy the odds and hold the line. But Selim was relentless. In 1517, at the Battle of Ridania, near Cairo, Tuman Bey's forces were crushed. The Ottomans stormed into Egypt. Cairo fell. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had ruled for over 250 years, was effectively dead. But Tuman Bey wasn't done. He escaped the city, fled to the south, began rallying support from tribal leaders, trying to mount a comeback. For a brief moment, it seemed he might become a symbol of resistance, one last ember in a fire gone cold. Selim wasn't having it. Tuman Bey was captured, brought back to Cairo. The Ottomans gave him no audience, no stage, no negotiation, just a sentence. On the 13th of April, 1517, he was taken to Bab Zuwayla, one of Cairo's ancient gates, a place that had seen centuries of parades, announcements, and executions. There, in full view of the city he had once ruled, Tuman Bey was hanged. The crowd watched silently. Some wept, others stared. Because this wasn't just the death of a man, it was the death of an era. The end of a dynasty built not on bloodlines, but on merit and military prowess. The Mamluks had begun as slave soldiers. They'd seized power with swords and governed for centuries. Tuman Bey was their final chapter. Selim declared Egypt part of the Ottoman Empire. The Caliphate was absorbed. The Mamluk elite were folded into the new regime or crushed beneath it. Tuman Bey's body hung as a warning, but in time, his memory shifted. He became a symbol not of failure, but of resistance, of courage against a wave too big to stop. He died a sultan, not just in title, but in defiance. And the empire moved on. But the next ruler on our list didn't die with honor or a crowd. He died beneath a collapsing roof, one that might have been designed to fall exactly when it did. Ghiyas al-Din Tughluq, Delhi Sultanate, 1325, crushed when a celebratory pavilion collapsed. Many think it was engineered. When Ghiyas al-Din Tughluq took the throne in 1320, he wasn't supposed to be a sultan, he was a soldier. A career warrior who rose through the ranks of the Delhi Sultanate, earning his place with sword and sweat. His path to power was forged in rebellion as he led a coup against the last Khalji ruler, establishing the Tughluq dynasty with blood still wet on his blade. But Ghiyas wasn't just a fighter, he was also a builder. Literally. He founded Tughluqabad, a massive fortified city on the southern edge of Delhi, designed to be the empire's new capital. Thick walls, high towers, red stone gleaming under the sun, it was his legacy, his monument, and his fortress. He ruled with a stern hand, efficient, ruthless, focused on law and order. He expanded the empire's borders and held down rebellions with relentless force. He wasn't beloved, but he was respected. He believed in discipline over decadence. And for 5 years, his empire looked stable. Until it didn't. In 1325, he returned to Delhi from a victorious campaign in Bengal. His son, Muhammad bin Tughluq, had been managing affairs in his absence and organized a grand celebration to welcome him home. A royal tented pavilion was erected in his honor, lavish, ceremonial and temporary. As Ghiyath entered, flanked by guards and dignitaries, the structure collapsed. Just like that. The Sultan was crushed beneath timbers and fabric. No sword, no arrow, just a sudden fall of wood and stone. He died on the spot, and the whispers began immediately. To some, it was a tragic accident, a miscalculation in construction, a flaw in the hurried celebration. To others, it was a setup. The target of suspicion? His son. Muhammad bin Tughluq had always been ambitious, brilliant even, a scholar, a thinker, a man whose mind burned too hot for politics to contain. And yet, he stood to gain everything from his father's death: the throne, the empire, the right to implement his own radical ideas without restraint. No investigation followed, no trial, no dissent. Muhammad took the throne with swift authority. The dynasty continued, but the tone had changed. If it was a murder, it was one of architecture. A sultan crushed not by rebellion, but by a falling roof at a welcome party planned by his heir. Ghiyath al-Din Tughluq's legacy was quickly buried, literally and figuratively. His great city, Tughluqabad, was abandoned soon after. His reign, remembered as stable and strong, became a footnote in the eccentric, often disastrous reign of his son. And so he joins history's most ironic exits, a ruler brought low not by war, not by conspiracy in the night, but by the very canopy built to celebrate his return. Still, at least his death left some ambiguity. The next emperor? His fate came with no such mystery. Just the dull certainty of being blinded, broken, and erased in the dark. Farrukhsiyar, Mughal India, 1719, deposed, blinded, and killed in prison. Farrukhsiyar wasn't supposed to be remembered as a tragedy. When he ascended to the Mughal throne in 1713, he seemed like the fresh blood the empire needed, young, sharp, and eager to rule. He had claimed the crown through force, defeating his predecessor with the help of the powerful Sayyid brothers, kingmakers, who held more real power than the emperor himself. At first, it was a mutually beneficial arrangement. Farrukhsiyar sat on the throne, wore the crown, and smiled for the portraits. The Sayyid brothers ran the show behind the scenes: diplomacy, military, administration. The machinery of empire rolled on. But ambition doesn't like sharing. As time passed, Farrukhsiyar began to chafe under their influence. He resented being a puppet. He tried to assert independence, fired ministers, built his own alliances, plotted, quietly, to remove the brothers from power. The Sayyids noticed. And in the corridors of the Mughal court, noticing was enough. By 1719, the tension snapped. The Sayyid brothers moved fast, surrounding the emperor with loyal troops. Farrukhsiyar was arrested, stripped of his titles, and thrown into a dark cell. No allies, no weapons, no options. The punishment came in pieces. First, they blinded him ritually, formally, as a clear disqualification from rulership. A Mughal emperor could not rule without vision, symbolic and brutal. Then they left him in prison to rot. But rot wasn't fast enough. Soon after, he was killed, quietly, without trial, without ceremony. A former emperor now reduced to a whisper in the palace walls. He had reigned for 6 years. The Mughal court moved on quickly. Another puppet emperor was installed. The Sayyid brothers continued to pull strings until their own downfall, which came just as swiftly. The empire itself was already cracking, its power shrinking, its borders bleeding, its authority questioned by Marathas, Sikhs, and British merchants with too much silver. Farrukhsiyar's death wasn't a shock, it was a symbol of what the empire had become, a shell where emperors were disposable and power had shifted to the shadows. His name faded, but his fate remained a cautionary tale. In a world where kings were born with divine right, sometimes all it took was one wrong alliance to end up blind, alone, and erased. And while Farrukhsiyar died behind palace doors, the next man on our list met his end in a tent at the hands of his own guards, chopped not just from the throne, but from history. Nadir Shah, Iran 1747, assassinated in his tent, body hacked by conspirators. Nadir Shah didn't rise to power, he exploded into it. Born into poverty in northeast Persia, he clawed his way to the top through sheer military genius and relentless brutality. He rescued the Safavid dynasty from collapse, then discarded it when it was no longer useful. He crowned himself Shah in 1736 and forged an empire through campaigns that scorched the map from Iran to India, from the Caucasus to Central Asia. His invasion of Mughal India became legendary. In 1739, he stormed Delhi and left it drenched in fear. He seized unimaginable wealth, including the Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond, and paraded it back to Persia like a dragon hoarding treasure. But what rises through terror often falls by it too. In his later years, Nadir's rule unraveled. He grew paranoid, distant, and erratic. The loyal general became a tyrant. The liberator of Persia became its nightmare. He executed his own family members, slaughtered nobles at the first hint of dissent. His once disciplined army grew resentful, tired of campaigns that felt more like punishments than glory. By 1747, the empire was cracking. Nadir set up camp in Khorasan, restless and increasingly unstable. He suspected conspiracies in every corner, heard betrayal in every whisper. His army had shrunk not in size, but in spirit. And among them, a plot was forming. One night, under cover of silence and stars, a group of his own officers crept into his tent. They didn't hesitate. There were no speeches, no confrontation, just a swift, calculated end. The man who had dominated Asia with fire and steel died not on a battlefield, but in the quiet folds of canvas, betrayed by men who once saluted him. His death sent shockwaves through the empire, but not because it was tragic, because it was inevitable. The realm he built fragmented almost immediately. No heir strong enough to hold it, no loyalist brave enough to restore it. Provinces broke off, warlords emerged. The legacy of Nadir Shah was reduced to gold, blood, and the knowledge that even the most terrifying emperors can't scare everyone forever. He died in the dark, surrounded by steel and silence. And the next emperor? He faced a different kind of quiet. The suffocating hush of exile and a rope slowly tightening in a distant corner of China. Yongli Emperor Zhu Yulang, Southern Ming, 1662, captured and executed by strangulation in Kunming. When the Ming dynasty fell in 1644, it didn't vanish, it splintered. The imperial capital, Beijing, had been taken by the Manchu-led Qing, but the south remained in rebellion. From these fragments, a flickering resistance emerged, the Southern Ming. Not a centralized regime, but a rotating cast of hopeful survivors, claiming legitimacy while watching their world disappear piece by piece. Enter Zhu Yulang, the Yongli Emperor. He wasn't the most obvious choice for a dynasty's final stand, A distant Ming relative, minor in court hierarchy, he rose more by default than destiny. After a series of short-lived puppet emperors either died or were captured, Zhu Yulang was elevated in 1646 as the last serious claimant to the Ming throne. From the start, he ruled on the run. His court was mobile one step ahead of the Qing. He fled from Guangxi to Guizhou, then to Yunnan. His government was made up of loyalists, military commanders, and Confucian scholars, desperately clinging to tradition while hiding in mountain fortresses. In name, he was Emperor of China. In reality, he was a refugee. As the Qing advanced, one by one, the strongholds fell. His generals were defeated, his support base thinned, the court fragmented. But Zhu Yulang refused to yield. He saw himself not just as a ruler, but as the last ember of a sacred lineage. He wore the robes, performed the rituals, issued decrees, even as the walls closed in. By 1659, with Qing troops approaching Yunnan, he sought refuge in Burma, hoping for shelter from the Burmese king. He was received with diplomacy, but watched with suspicion. The presence of a Chinese emperor in exile was both an honor and a threat. For a time, he was housed, fed, even granted audiences. But his welcome wore thin. The Qing, determined to end any future rebellion, sent envoys and threats. Pressure mounted. Eventually, the Burmese folded. In 1661, they handed Zhu Yulang over. He was marched back to China, not as a prisoner of war, but as a captured symbol. In 1662, in Kunming, the Yongle Emperor, the last flicker of the Ming, was executed. Not on a battlefield, not in a siege, but quietly, by strangulation. A closed-loop ending for a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. There was no parade, no trial, just a single moment in a forgotten city where the old world was put to sleep. Zhu Yulang's death ended not just a reign but an era. The southern Ming dissolved with him, his family was scattered, the resistance faded, and the Qing solidified their control. But in the folk memory of southern China, he became more than a failed emperor. He was remembered as the man who refused to stop pretending even when everyone else had. From exile to strangulation, his journey was one long refusal to bow. And across the seas, on the volcanic islands of Java, another king faced a violent end, not in exile, but in his palace, in a storm of blades and betrayal. Kertanagara of Singasari, Java 1292, assassinated in his palace. Chroniclers say attackers slashed off his ear. Kertanagara, the last ruler of the Singhasari kingdom in Java, didn't fear Mongols, rebellions, or omens. He had style, charisma, and a flair for the dramatic. He was a devotee of Tantric Buddhism, a patron of the arts, and a visionary who saw beyond his island's shores. He wanted an empire that stretched across the archipelago, and he wasn't shy about it. Under his rule, Singhasari reached its zenith. He subdued rivals, dominated trade routes, and projected power as far as Sumatra and Bali. But with every expansion, he made enemies. At home, abroad, even across continents. In 1289, the Mongol Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan sent envoys to demand tribute. It was standard procedure. Most rulers, faced with Mongol muscle, complied. Kertanagara did not. He didn't just refuse, he insulted them. Specifically, he scarred one envoy's face and sliced the other's ear. A message not just of rejection, but of pure defiance. The Mongols didn't forget. But before their revenge arrived, Kertanagara's world collapsed from within. One of his former vassals, Jayakatwang of Kediri, saw the opportunity. While Kertanagara was focused on foreign threats, Jayakatwang struck. His troops attacked the Seqenenre capital during a ceremonial event, catching the king off guard. The palace, once a symbol of power and mysticism, became a killing ground. Kertanagara fought back briefly, then the walls gave way. He was killed inside his own sanctuary. The chroniclers say his attackers cut off his ear as a grim echo of the insult he had given the Mongols. The symbolism was sharp, the payback even sharper. His body was treated with the rituals reserved for divine kings. He was cremated, his ashes scattered, and his spirit deified in temples as a bodhisattva. But his kingdom didn't survive. Singhasari fell, Jayakatwang claimed the throne, and then, in a twist worthy of epic drama, the Mongols finally arrived, only to find their target already dead. The invaders redirected their fury at Jayakatwang, toppling his regime. And out of that chaos rose the Majapahit Empire, founded by Kertanagara's loyalists, who avenged his death and fulfilled his dream of uniting the archipelago. In dying, Kertanagara became the seed of something larger. His assassination was not the end of his story. It was the ignition point of the next chapter in Javanese history. And speaking of rulers who refused to bow to foreign threats, our next royal death comes straight from the Korean palace, where assassins didn't wait for rebellion to rise. They snuck in, blades drawn, under cover of politics and fear. Empress Myeongseong, Korea, 1895, stabbed to death by Japanese agents in Gyeongbokgung, body burned. Empress Myeongseong, often known in the West as Queen Min, was not born into power, but she claimed it like she had invented the concept. She married King Gojong of Joseon, Korea at 16. At first, she played the role of the silent royal consort. Then she stepped out from behind the screen. She wasn't content to be a background figure. She studied statecraft, forged alliances, and maneuvered her way into becoming the political core of the royal court. Her rival factions hated her. Scholars admired her. Foreign diplomats feared her. Because she wasn't just playing palace politics, she was rewriting the rules. In the 1892nd, Korea was under siege not from armies, but from influence. China, Russia, and Japan were all circling like vultures. Myeongseong saw Japan's growing power with a clarity most others lacked, and she didn't trust it. She began courting Russia as a counterweight, strengthening ties, playing geopolitical chess to keep Korea independent. Japan noticed. In the early morning hours of the 8th of October, 1895, a group of agents, many of them linked to the Japanese legation, entered Gyeongbokgung Palace. Dressed in court robes, they blended in with the guards. What followed was a ruthless, silent raid on the heart of the royal residence. They made their way to Myeongseong's quarters. She was confronted. There was no escape. In moments, the Empress was attacked and killed. To erase the evidence, her body was burned in the palace gardens. The attempt wasn't just to silence her, but to erase her legacy, an act of political violence masquerading as palace upheaval. But it didn't work. The world reacted with horror. The Korean people were devastated. Anti-Japanese sentiment soared. And though Japan denied official involvement, history remembered differently. Myeongseong became a symbol of resistance, of sovereignty, of a Korea caught between empires. Statues would be raised, novels written. Her death became more than an assassination. It became a wound that never quite healed, and it set the tone for the century to come, one of shadows, occupations, and a struggle for identity. All sparked by a queen who dared to say no and paid the price in silence, fire, and defiance. But not all royal deaths come with intrigue and armies. Some come in boxes, sealed, unopened. Crown Prince Sado Korea, 1762, sealed in a rice chest by royal order and left to starve. Korean history has no shortage of tragic royals, but none unravel with quite the psychological precision or haunting slow burn of Crown Prince Sado. He was born in 1735, the heir to King Yeongjo of Joseon, and from birth he bore the full weight of expectation. His father was one of Korea's most meticulous rulers, intelligent, reform-minded, and utterly intolerant of weakness. For a crown prince, this was a nightmare in brocade. To outsiders, Sado's early life looked idyllic. He received the best tutors, was dressed in silks, and bowed under golden ceilings. But, behind the court etiquette, the prince was unraveling. As he grew older, stories began to circulate of erratic moods, violent outbursts, paranoia. He feared thunder. He was obsessed with clothing. He wandered the palace at night. By his 20s, those rumors darkened. Courtiers whispered of violence, cruelty, breakdowns. Whether these were the signs of untreated mental illness or the fabrications of a toxic court remains debated. Some scholars argue he was manipulated, isolated by those hoping to block his ascension. Others suggest his behavior was real and terrifying. His mother reportedly feared him. His wife, Lady Hye-gyong, wrote memoirs that described a palace steeped in dread. She didn't excuse Sado, she recorded the fear. But she also pointed to the larger machinery, the pressures of royal life, the cold perfection demanded by King Yeongjo, and the ways that court rituals became instruments of torture. The breaking point came in 1762. At age 27, Sado was summoned to court after a series of disturbing incidents, accusations, threats, perhaps even deaths. King Yeongjo, unwilling to execute his own son directly due to Confucian law and royal image, chose a different path. He ordered Sado to climb into a wooden rice chest. It was an act wrapped in ceremony, a punishment meant to preserve royal dignity while ensuring death. The chest was sealed. It was midsummer, hot, airless. The palace waited. The court whispered. After 8 days, Sado was dead. The chest was opened, the body removed, and the court carried on. To the public, the official story was carefully sculpted. Illness, misfortune, a tragic accident. Only later did the full narrative emerge through letters, records, and the heartbreaking memoirs of Lady Hye-gyong. Sado's son, Jeongjo, would eventually become king, ruling with intelligence and sensitivity. He rehabilitated his father's name in secret, naming him Emperor Yangzhou posthumously and building monuments in his memory. But the wound remained. Crown Prince Sado wasn't killed in battle, poisoned by enemies, or cut down by foreign agents. He died inside a box, sealed away by a father who couldn't bring himself to kill, but wouldn't let him live. The most royal of deaths, and the most lonely. And if death by confinement is disturbing, wait until the next entry, a child emperor drowned in the arms of his grandmother as dynasties collapsed into the sea. Emperor Antoku Japan, 1185, drowned during the naval battle of Dan no Yura while being carried by his grandmother. The Genpei War was Japan's civil war of legends, samurai battles, family feuds, tides of destiny, and in the center of its final, shattering act was a boy too young to understand the banners waving in his name. Emperor Antoku was crowned at the age of 2, not because he'd earned it, but because the Taira clan needed a symbol, a face, a divine bloodline. He was the grandson of Taira no Kiyomori, a warlord who had taken the imperial court by the throat and turned the throne into a pawn. For years, the Taira ruled through the child emperor, fighting off the rival Minamoto clan. But power built on a toddler's shoulders rarely lasts. In 1185, the two forces collided at the Battle of Dan no Yura, a naval showdown in the narrow straits of western Japan. Warships lined the water like chess pieces. Arrows flew, swords clashed. And at the center of it all sat the 7-year-old emperor, perched in the Taira command ship under banners of crimson and gold. At first, the tides favored the Taira. Then, the currents literally turned. A change in sea flow, a betrayal by a Taira defector. Suddenly, the Minamoto were boarding their ships, cutting down defenders, claiming the victory stroke by stroke. The Taira, realizing the battle was lost, made a decision rooted in their deepest beliefs. The emperor must not fall into enemy hands. His grandmother, Lady Ni, took the boy in her arms. She wrapped him in imperial robes. She whispered prayers, and then she leapt into the sea with him. Together, they sank beneath the waves, one as a child of heaven, the other as a loyal guardian. The boy's small crown sank with them, lost in the currents. Antoku's body was never recovered. He became, in death, a symbol of purity, loyalty, and tragic fate. In some traditions, he was even deified, transformed into a kami, a spirit god of the drowned and the lost. Dan no Yura marked the end of the Taira. The surviving clan members committed ritual suicide. The Minamoto seized power, and the age of the samurai shogunate began. But the image of Antoku innocent, doomed, wrapped in silk as the sea swallowed, the empire remained etched in Japan's memory. And yet, even the sea can't match the brutality of a coup masked in ceremony, where a king priest one day finds himself killed the next, perhaps by bludgeon, perhaps by strangulation, in the shadows of a kingdom turning its back. King Taksin Siam, Thailand, 1782, executed after a coup. Sources vary. Bludgeoning, strangulation. Taksin the Great was never meant to be king. He was born in Ayutthaya, the child of a Chinese immigrant and a Siamese mother, in a kingdom that prized lineage over merit. But when the Burmese sacked Ayutthaya in 1767, burning the capital to ash, something inside Taksin ignited. He gathered remnants of the army, built alliances, fought back. Within months, he had retaken territory and declared a new capital at Thonburi. Within years, he had driven out the Burmese, reunited Siam, and declared himself king. He wasn't just a general. He was a miracle. For 15 years, Taksin rebuilt a shattered kingdom. He centralized power, reformed the economy, revived Buddhism, and tried to fuse Thai and Chinese traditions into something new. But greatness comes with shadows. As his reign matured, his behavior shifted. Reports described him as increasingly erratic, harsh, obsessed with religious purification. He punished monks, held grand rituals, claimed divine visions. Some courtiers whispered he had gone mad. Others said he was simply too powerful. The army, once his instrument of liberation, began to grumble. Enter General Chow Phraya Chakri. He was one of Taksin's most trusted commanders, sent abroad on military campaigns. But while Chakri was away, the court turned on the king. A group of nobles staged a coup, declaring Taksin unfit to rule. Chakri returned at just the right moment with enough soldiers to take control. Taksin was arrested, stripped of his titles, confined. The execution was quiet, obscured by rumor. Some said he was bludgeoned to death with a sandalwood club, as tradition required for royalty. Others claimed he was strangled behind closed doors. The details blurred. The outcome didn't. He was dead. The Chakri dynasty was born. To legitimize the new rule, King Rama I Chakri himself raised Taksin to posthumous honor, Statues were built, his reputation polished, the madness softened into mysticism, the betrayal rebranded as necessity. But beneath the incense and bronze tributes, the truth lingered. Taksin, the man who saved Siam, died at the hands of his own court, his own commanders, in a quiet act of royal erasure. His reign ended not in defeat, but in the stillness of a kingdom that had moved on without him. And next, the young monarch who met a bullet in his bedroom, and whose death still echoes with unanswered questions, King Ananda, Mahidol, Thailand, 1946, found shot dead in the royal palace, under still mysterious circumstances. The year was 1946. The world was still reeling from World War II, and Thailand, caught between Axis diplomacy and nationalist undercurrents, was trying to redefine itself in the emerging post-war order. Amid all this stood a quiet, scholarly young king named Ananda Mahidol Rama, the 8th of the Chakri dynasty. Just 20 years old. He wasn't supposed to be king. Ananda was studying in Switzerland when he unexpectedly inherited the throne in 1935 after the abdication of his uncle, Rama VII. He was only 9 years old at the time, and Thailand was moving toward constitutional monarchy. For years, he ruled in name only, under a regency council, while completing his education abroad. When he returned to Thailand in December 1945, the country was eager for stability. The young king seemed to embody it. Polite, reserved, introspective, a student of law, a figure the Thai people could admire in a world rapidly coming apart. His return was celebrated as the beginning of a new, calmer era for the monarchy. And then, barely 6 months later, it ended. On the morning of the 9th of June, 1946, King Ananda was found dead in his bedroom at the Baramphimon Throne Hall in Bangkok, a gunshot wound to the head. His .45 caliber Colt pistol was nearby. The palace announced it as an accident. Perhaps the young king had been handling his weapon and it discharged unintentionally, but the story didn't sit right. Questions piled up immediately. The room had been locked from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle, and the king was known to be cautious, even uncomfortable, around firearms. Then came the suicide theory. Then, the whispers of assassination. Political factions began pointing fingers. The regents, the government, the army, the palace staff. Theories multiplied like shadows, a political killing disguised as an accident, an internal royal conflict, a power move gone wrong. The most chilling detail, no one ever figured it out. 3 palace officials were later tried and convicted of involvement, then executed. But years later, questions about the fairness of that trial, the evidence, and the motivations behind it only deepened the mystery. To this day, historians, legal scholars, and royal biographers remain divided. What's clear is that the young king's death tore a hole in Thai history. The nation grieved, the monarchy was shaken, and into the vacuum stepped his younger brother Bhumibol Adulyadej, who would go on to become the longest reigning monarch in Thai history. But Ananda? He became a symbol. Not just of lost potential, but of a mystery that the nation was never quite allowed to solve. His image remains preserved, gentle, youthful, and frozen in time, while the truth remains sealed behind palace walls. And speaking of sealed fates, the next royal story comes with no mystery, only machine guns, betrayal, and the fall of an entire dynasty. King Birendra and Queen Aishwarya, Nepal, 2001. Machine-gunned in the Royal Palace Massacre. The 1st of June 2001 began like any other royal evening in Nepal's Narayanhiti Palace. A family dinner, wine, laughter, the gathering of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. But by the end of the night, the walls of the palace would echo with gunfire, and the crown would be dripping with blood. King Birendra was a beloved figure. He had led Nepal through its transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional rule in the 1992nd. Calm, composed, deeply respected, Queen Aishwarya, equally regal, was known for her strong personality and political acumen. Together, they represented stability in a fragile kingdom wedged between giants. But beneath the image of unity, tensions brewed. Crown Prince Dipendra, their eldest son, was at odds with his parents over politics, responsibilities, and especially over marriage. He wanted to wed a woman they disapproved of. Family drama, royal style. Except here, the consequences weren't just awkward dinners, they were apocalyptic. That night, during the family banquet, Dipendra allegedly left the room, changed into military fatigues, and returned armed to the teeth. What happened next is one of the most horrifying episodes in modern royal history. In a spree that lasted minutes, but felt like hours, Dipendra opened fire on his family, his father, mother, siblings, uncles, aunts. When it was over, 9 members of the royal family were dead or mortally wounded. Dipendra himself was found collapsed in the garden with a self-inflicted wound. He was declared king while in a coma, an irony almost too surreal to believe. He died 3 days later. The massacre left the country stunned. The line of succession was scrambled. King Gyanendra, Birendra's brother, took the throne under a cloud of suspicion and disbelief. Conspiracy theories flooded the streets. Some said Dipendra couldn't have done it alone. Others believed he was a scapegoat. The lack of a transparent investigation only fed the fire. What's certain is that the massacre destroyed more than lives. It broke the spell of monarchy in Nepal. Trust was gone. Reverence was gone. The royal family never recovered. By 2008, just 7 years later, the monarchy was formally abolished. Nepal became a republic, and the palace turned into a public museum. Visitors walk through halls once soaked in quiet power and maybe something more terrible. They look at the blood-stained furniture, the preserved rooms, and they wonder how it all went so wrong, so fast. King Birendra and Queen Aishwarya were once symbols of unity. They died in silence, betrayed from within. Their fall didn't just end a family, it ended an entire form of rule. And yet, centuries earlier, another king met a fate that was just as chilling, put on display like a trophy, caged until death, while his enemies watched and history forgot. King Anuvong Vientiane, Laos, 1829, displayed and left to die in an iron cage in Bangkok. Anuvong was a king with dreams too large for the kingdom he ruled. As the last sovereign of the kingdom of Vientiane, one of the Lao tributary states under Siamese control, he dared to dream of independence, pride, and unity for the Lao people. And that dream would cost him everything. For most of his reign, Anuvong played the diplomatic game well. He paid tribute to Siam, maintained polite relations, but underneath the bows and offerings, resentment brewed. The Siamese court treated Laos as a vassal, its kings as little more than glorified governors. Anuvong wanted more. In 1826, he acted. Gathering his forces, he launched a surprise rebellion, marching on Bangkok while Siamese attention was turned elsewhere. For a moment, it worked. He caught them off guard. The Lao armies pushed deep into Siamese territory. Pride surged. For the first time in generations, It looked like Vientiane might stand on its own. Then came the response. The Siamese counterattack was overwhelming, and Uvong's forces were crushed. His capital, Vientiane, was captured and reduced to rubble. The city, once a center of art, religion, and trade, was wiped from the map. And Uvong fled north, hoping to rally new support, but he was betrayed, captured, and delivered to the Siamese court. And then came the cage. Rather than execute him immediately, the Siamese chose spectacle. They placed Uvong in an iron cage public, humiliating, dehumanizing, and displayed him in Bangkok for all to see. The once proud king reduced to a curiosity, a warning. There he sat for days, exposed to the elements, exposed to jeering crowds, starved, broken. Eventually, he died. No sword, no trial, just a slow, suffocating decay under the open sky. His death marked the true end of the kingdom of Vientiane. Its culture was absorbed, its people scattered, its language marginalized. The cage worked not just as punishment, but as erasure. And yet, in modern Laos, Uvong is remembered not as a failure, but as a hero. Statues honor him, streets bear his name. His rebellion, though doomed, became the seed of national identity. He died in a cage, but he left behind an open question. What does it mean to be free? And next comes a king whose freedom ended with an arrow loosed in silence, one final act of vengeance that would alter the course of an entire mountain kingdom. Langdarma, Tibet, c. 842, assassinated by a monk who loosed an arrow from a hidden bow. Langdarma was never meant to be a spiritual villain, but in the ancient chronicles of Tibet, he's cast as the king who tried to unmake enlightenment itself. He came to power during a volatile time. The Tibetan Empire, once expansive and militarily feared, was in slow disintegration. Internally, rival factions stirred. Externally, enemies watched for weakness. The dynasty was fraying, but more crucially, so was its soul. Langdarma's brother, Rinpoche, had embraced Buddhism, making it a pillar of royal identity. Under his reign, monasteries flourished, monks wielded influence, Sanskrit texts flowed in translation. Tibet was becoming not just a kingdom, but a spiritual beacon. Langdarma changed that overnight. When Rinpoche died under circumstances never quite cleared of suspicion, Langdarma took the throne, and almost immediately, he reversed everything. According to tradition, he was either a convert to the ancient Bon religion or simply saw monastic power as a threat. Whatever his motives, the result was the same. He shuttered monasteries, banished monks, halted construction of sacred texts and temples. The Buddhist establishment, which had grown comfortably within royal favor, was suddenly on the run. It was more than a policy change. It was a cultural purge. And within that storm, resistance brewed not in armies, but in robes. Enter Hlalung Pelgi Dorji, a Buddhist monk, or maybe a phantom, or maybe just a man pushed to the brink by watching his entire world be unraveled. The stories say he approached Langdarma under the guise of a simple monk, shaved head, black robe, unarmed. Except he wasn't. He concealed a small bow beneath his robes. As he stood before the king, he drew, aimed, and fired a single arrow. Langdarma fell. Dead. Just like that. Some versions say the monk fled on a black horse. Others say he vanished. In all versions, the killing was swift, symbolic, and decisive. A moment of pure political theatre and revenge. With Langdarma's death, Tibet plunged into fragmentation. The empire collapsed. Regional warlords divided the land. Buddhism went underground for centuries, surviving in pockets, waiting to re-emerge. but the act itself became legend. A king felled not by rival claimants, not by foreign invaders, but by a monk who traded chance for a weapon. Langdarma's legacy is complicated. Some historians argue he wasn't nearly as anti-Buddhist as the legends claim. Others say his crackdown was exaggerated over centuries of hagiography. But in the national psyche of Tibet, he remains the archetype of the usurper king, the one who turned against the Dharma. And the monk? Immortalized. A single arrow became a symbol of resistance, not against a man, but against an erasure of belief. Still, Tibet would recover, eventually. The empire did not. And in another corner of Asia, a different emperor was about to face a far less symbolic end, thrust into power, stripped of it in days, and left to die in custody without a crown or even a chance. Emperor Dục Đức, Vietnam, 1883. Deposed after 3 days and starved to death in custody. It takes some rulers years to unravel their reigns. Dục Đức did it in 3 days. In the final years of Vietnam's Nguyen dynasty, the court had become a minefield of politics, French colonial pressure, and internal decay. The emperor, Tughluq, died childless in 1883. Before his death, he left instructions on who should succeed him, but the plan quickly fell apart. The mandarins of the imperial court ignored the late emperor's pick and installed a new one, Dục Đức, a young, western-leaning royal who had the name but not the approval of the old guard. He stepped into the throne in the sweltering summer of that year, and was gone by the weekend. The official charge? Disrespect to his predecessor's wishes, secretive behavior, immorality. The real reason? He was out of sync with the mandarins, the powerful bureaucrats who preferred tradition over reform and obedience over charisma. Duc Ducai's ideas, rumoured leniencies, and refusal to play the role of pliant figurehead made him a threat to the old order. So they did what power brokers always do when threatened. They rewrote the script. He was deposed on day 3. No uprising, no riots. Just a quiet shift behind palace doors. The imperial decree was changed, and Duc Ducai's name was scrubbed from official succession documents. He was taken to a secluded compound and placed under confinement, a former emperor at 31, an afterthought by 32. And then, sometime later, he died. Starvation was the method. No open execution, no blades. No official proclamation, just isolation, neglect, and silence. A slow, deliberate disappearance. He wasn't even given a royal burial until years later, after enough time had passed and enough emperors had come and gone for the shame to settle into history. Dục Đức holds a dubious record, the shortest reign in Vietnamese imperial history, but his death speaks volumes. Not about incompetence, but about how little room there was for deviation. In a court defined by ritual, hierarchy, and internal feuds, the throne was not a seat, it was a trap, and for Dục Đức there was no escape once the gate closed. But if he died in quiet obscurity, the next royal death came on the world stage with treasure, betrayal, and the clash of empires. Atahualpa, Inca, 1533, garroted by Pizarro after paying a colossal ransom. Atahualpa didn't just rule an empire, he was the empire. When the Spanish arrived in South America, the Inca Empire was a marvel of engineering, agriculture, and centralized control. Stone cities threaded through mountains, roads that linked thousands of miles. A society with no currency but perfect logistics. And standing atop it all was the Sapa Inca divine son of the Sunday. In 1532, that man was Atahualpa. Except the empire wasn't at peace. Atahualpa had just won a bloody civil war against his brother, Huáscar, seizing control of the capital and consolidating power. His armies were loyal, his court was stable, his authority unquestioned. And then, into this universe of gods and stone, walked Francisco Pizarro with fewer than 200 men. Atahualpa agreed to meet the strangers. He was curious, perhaps amused. The meeting took place in the highland city of Cajamarca. No weapons, just diplomacy. Or so he thought. The Spanish ambushed him. Cannons, horses, steel. Atahualpa's guards were slaughtered. He was captured on the spot. A god, trapped in a cage. But this wasn't a quick execution. Pizarro saw opportunity. Atahualpa offered a ransom the largest ever recorded. He promised to fill a room with gold and silver if they let him go. The Spanish agreed. The treasure began pouring in: ornaments, ceremonial artifacts, statues. Gold melted down into ingots. And then, once it was delivered, they killed him anyway. No trial, no ceremony. Just a garrote, slow, deliberate strangulation. To make it palatable to the public, they accused him of treason and idolatry. But the truth was simpler. Pizarro couldn't let him live. As long as Atahualpa existed, he was a symbol, a rallying point, a god in chains. So they erased him. His body was either burned or buried, accounts vary. His empire collapsed within months. The Spanish marched on Cuzco. The Inca world, which had taken centuries to build, was dismantled in a decade. And Atahualpa? He remains one of history's most tragic figures. Not just because he died after paying the price of his life, but because he never saw the game being played. He didn't lose a war. He sat down at the wrong table and lost the world. Cuauhtémoc, Aztec, 1522nd, hanged on Cortés's Honduras march. Last Tlatoani executed en route. Cuauhtémoc was never supposed to lead an empire under siege. He was young, barely into his 20s, when fate handed him the ashes of Tenochtitlan and said, "Try to fix this." He was chosen as Tlatoani ruler at the very worst moment in Aztec history. Smallpox had gutted the capital. The people were starving. The Spanish had regrouped after their temporary defeat in the Noche Triste. And Hernán Cortés was coming back with more men, more allies, and an unshakable determination to break the city once and for all. Cuauhtémoc stepped up with fire in his chest. He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't interested in surrender. He was a warrior king, forged by desperation. For months, he led the defense of Tenochtitlan as the Spanish siege closed around the city. Every bridge was fought over, every canal ran with resistance. But starvation and disease did what swords could not. On the 13th of August, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to flee across Lake Texcoco. He was brought before Cortés and reportedly said, "I have done what I could to defend my people. Now take this knife and finish me." Cortés didn't point not yet. Instead, he kept Cuauhtémoc alive, for now, as a trophy, as a symbol of conquered power. He paraded him, consulted him, and possibly even kept him around to help legitimize Spanish rule in the early days of colonial consolidation. But Cuauhtémoc wasn't quiet. He didn't assimilate. He resisted in the only ways left to him: through influence, through presence, through the whisper of defiance. The Spanish always suspected him of plotting rebellion, of trying to rally the remnants of the Aztec elite, of biding his time. In 1525, Cortes decided to take a military expedition to Honduras, and for reasons that remain murky paranoia, politics, convenience, he brought Cuauhtémoc with him, alongside other surviving Nahua nobles. It was a long, brutal march through the jungles. Disease, heat, malaria, descent. Somewhere along the way, Cortes became convinced that Cuauhtémoc was conspiring against him, that a rebellion was being hatched in the trees. So he ordered the execution. Cuauhtémoc was hanged from a ceiba tree, tall, sacred, wide-limbed. No trial, no confession. Just an order, a rope, and the end of the Aztec resistance. The last Tlatoani of the Mexica died not in battle, but on a Spanish march, thousands of miles from the city he once ruled. The empire was gone, its ruler reduced to a footnote in a conquistador's memoir. But to the people of Mexico, Cuauhtémoc became more than a casualty. He became a symbol. Statues bear his likeness. Streets and towns bear his name. His defiance, his refusal to bow, and his brutal, quiet end made him into something the Spanish couldn't control. A martyr with a long shadow. And just decades later, another last sovereign of another native empire would fall, this time beheaded in the very city his ancestors had once ruled. Tupac Amaru, I Neo-Inca, 1572, captured in Vilcabamba and publicly beheaded in Cuzco. By the time Tupac Amaru I became ruler of the Neo-Inca state, the sun had already set on the empire of his ancestors. The Spaniards had conquered Cuzco decades earlier. Atahualpa was long dead. The Inca heartland had been colonized, churches raised over temples, roads claimed by foreign boots. But in the deep, remote valleys of Vilcabamba, a thread of sovereignty still remained. That thread was fragile. The Neo-Inca state, as it came to be known, was a resistance government, part sanctuary, part symbol. The Spanish called it rebellious. The Inca called it survival. Tupac Amaru, I was raised in this shrinking world of defiance, a child of survivors, a prince of the forest. When his brother, the Sapa Inca Titu Cusi, died in 1571, Tupac Amaru became ruler reluctantly, it seems, but without options. His people needed a leader. Spain needed a final submission. Tensions flared almost immediately. The Spanish viceroy in Lima demanded submission. Tupac Amaru, perhaps emboldened by isolation, perhaps hardened by inheritance, refused. It's unclear whether he actively planned a rebellion or simply continued resisting colonial demands, but that was enough. Spain launched a military campaign into Vilcabamba. The march was grueling, dense jungle, steep cliffs, unfamiliar terrain, but the Spanish pressed forward. They attacked the last Inca city, burned it, and pushed the resistance deeper into the mountains. Tupac Amaru fled. He was chased across rivers and valleys for weeks. Finally, exhausted and betrayed by local allies, he was captured. They brought him back to Cuzco, the very city his ancestors had ruled as gods. It was no longer his capital. It was now a Spanish city, lined with cathedrals and stone reminders of conquest. There, on the plaza, in full view of a crowd forced to watch, the Spanish beheaded him. It wasn't just an execution, it was a spectacle, a message. The last Inca sovereign was gone, the dynasty ended, the resistance scattered. But as with all symbols, death only made Tupac Amaru louder. Centuries later, in the 18th century, another revolutionary, José Gabriel Condorcanqui, would adopt his name and launch an indigenous uprising as Tupac Amaru II. The Spanish executed him too. But by then, The name had already become legend. Tupac Amaru I died on Spanish stone in a foreign-draped plaza, but his spirit threaded itself through rebellion, memory, and identity. And before him, in the very heart of that first collapse, stood the emperor who never made it out of his own capital, whose death still echoes in confusion, as allies, enemies, and invaders all pointed fingers in the chaos.
Mobutu Sese Seko built a vast patronage state in Zaire with pervasive repression and political killings. Mobutu Sese Seko didn't just rule Zaire, he branded it. The leopard skin hat, the oversized sunglasses, the Mao-style suits, they were all part of a carefully crafted image. But behind the fashion iconography was a brutal dictator who turned corruption into a national identity and repression into routine. Coming to power in 1965, after a coup supported by Western intelligence agencies, Mobutu promised stability. He delivered a spectacle. Streets and cities were renamed. Colonial names were banned. He renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ingbendu wa Zabanga, which loosely translates to the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. Subtle. Under Mobutu, Zaire became a case study in kleptocracy. State resources were funneled into the pockets of his family and cronies. The military, bloated and underpaid, acted as both guard and enforcer. Political opposition was not just discouraged, it was erased. Those who dared to criticize the regime were jailed, exiled, or killed. He maintained power through a system of patronage, so intricate it practically replaced governance. Loyalty was rewarded. Disloyalty meant obscurity, or worse. Parliament existed, but it echoed only Mobutu. The press was muzzled. The judiciary bent at the knee. Zaire's natural wealth, its diamonds, copper, cobalt, should have built a prosperous nation. Instead, it funded Mobutu's lavish lifestyle, villas across Europe, private jets, and refrigerated Mercedes limousines. Meanwhile, hospitals ran out of supplies, and teachers went unpaid. Despite this, Mobutu held on to power for over 3 decades, in part thanks to Cold War dynamics. As long as he remained anti-communist, Western governments tolerated, sometimes even supported his rule. But when the Cold War ended, so did the excuses. By the late 1992, rebellion spread. His health faltered. His allies evaporated. He fled the country in 1997 and died shortly after in exile. Mobutu left behind a hollowed-out state, where institutions had collapsed and trust had vanished. The next leaders would inherit not just a ruined economy, but a population exhausted by decades of rule by theft. And just across the Horn of Africa, another strongman was busy turning city streets into war zones, leveling entire neighborhoods. Mohamed Siad Barre bombed northern cities. For example, Hargeisa, 1988, slaughtering Isaac civilians. Mohamed Siad Barre came to power in Somalia with promises of scientific socialism, unity, and progress. In the early days, his regime nationalized industry, expanded education, and projected strength. But behind the slogans, the seeds of authoritarian rule were already sprouting. After a failed war with Ethiopia in the late 1972, Barre's regime began to unravel. Clan divisions deepened, the economy collapsed, and dissent boiled over. What Barre did next wasn't reform, it was retaliation. In the north, the Isaaq clan was seen as disloyal. In 1988, rebel groups from the Somali National Movement launched attacks against government forces. Barre's response was brutal and disproportionate. Entire cities like Hargeisa and Burao were bombed from the air. Neighborhoods were flattened. Civilians were targeted. Hundreds of thousands were displaced. The Isaaq population bore the brunt. Homes were razed, markets destroyed, mass arrests followed. Families fled across the border into Ethiopia, while those who stayed were rounded up, imprisoned, or killed. Human rights organizations would later describe it as one of the most severe campaigns of violence against civilians in Africa during the late 20th century. Barre insisted he was restoring order, but what he was really doing was collapsing the state from within. His rule depended on fear, surveillance, and loyalty to the regime above all. As opposition spread, so did the repression. By 1991, after years of conflict and collapse, Siad Barre was overthrown. He fled into exile, leaving behind a shattered nation. Somalia descended into civil war, factionalism, and humanitarian disaster, a crisis that echoes to this day. And while Barre's military rained shells on his own cities, the next warlord turned president on our list exported violence across borders, arming rebels, fueling chaos, and profiting from a civil war that spanned nations. Charles Taylor, convicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone for aiding and abetting atrocities, murder, rape, enslavement. Charles Taylor didn't just break Sierra Leone, he monetized it. Rising through the ranks of Liberia's power struggles, Taylor eventually led a rebellion that overthrew the Liberian government in 1989. But his legacy was cemented not in his home country, but in the carnage he helped unleash across the border. Taylor provided weapons, training, and logistical support to the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, in Sierra Leone, a rebel group infamous for its cruelty. In exchange, he received blood diamonds, illicit gems smuggled out of war zones, and traded for arms. It was a deal written in destruction. The RUF's atrocities shocked the world. Villages were razed, civilians were abducted, mass amputations became a calling card, children were forced into militias. Taylor's fingerprints were all over it, not just as a passive supporter, but as an active participant in a transnational network of violence. During his presidency in Liberia, 1997-2003, Taylor ruled with a mix of populism and paranoia. His forces cracked down on dissent. Journalists were intimidated. Opponents disappeared. But all the while, he denied involvement in Sierra Leone, claiming ignorance as the diamonds kept flowing. In 2003, under mounting pressure and a rebel siege of Monrovia, Taylor resigned and fled into exile, but the international community didn't forget. He was arrested, extradited, and tried by the Special Court for Sierra Leone. In 2012, Charles Taylor became the first former head of state convicted by an international court since Nuremberg. His sentence: 50 years in prison for aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity. Taylor's case was a landmark. It sent a message: even those who wear suits, hold office, and speak at podiums can be judged for what they do in the shadows. And as Taylor began his sentence behind bars, Europe was still grappling with a ghost from its own past, a generalissimo who ruled in silence after the gunfire stopped, but whose prisons and policies outlived the war that brought him to power. Francisco Franco post-war white terror executions and forced labor scarred Spain for decades. Francisco Franco won the Spanish Civil War, but the victory came at a staggering human cost. From 1939 onward, he ruled Spain as a caudillo, part general, part monarch, and all authoritarian. While the war had devastated the country, Franco's peacetime policies ensured that the suffering didn't end with the final bullet. What followed his ascent was a campaign of post-war repression known as the White Terror. It wasn't about fighting enemies anymore. It was about erasing them. Franco's regime systematically hunted down former Republicans, union leaders, intellectuals, and suspected leftists. Courts were replaced with military tribunals. Sentences were often death. Tens of thousands were executed in the years following the war. Many more were imprisoned. Spain's prisons overflowed with political detainees, many sentenced to hard labor. Roads, dams, and infrastructure projects across the country were built by these forced laborers, quiet monuments to a regime that demanded both obedience and silence. Franco's Spain also censored everything. Newspapers, films, literature, all filtered through the lens of Catholic nationalism. Regional identities, like those of the Basques and Catalans, were suppressed. Their languages were banned from public life. The state's vision was singular: one Spain, under one rule, with one story. Over time, international pressure and internal fatigue forced Franco to liberalize slightly. But real opposition remained illegal, and the culture of fear endured. Even after his death in 1975, the scars remained. Spain's transition to democracy was peaceful, but its memory was fragile. For years, public discussion of Franco's crimes was muted under the so-called Pact of Forgetting. Yet the legacy of the White Terror remains in mass graves and unmarked cemeteries. The victims are still being identified. The silence is slowly being broken. And while Franco's repression was wrapped in tradition and religion, his contemporary in Portugal built a similar regime, one that quietly erased dissent from behind the stone walls of a colonial-era prison. Antonio Salazar, Portugal's Pied, secret police ran torture prisons, notably the Tarrafal camp. Antonio Salazar didn't shout. He lectured. A former economics professor turned dictator, Salazar ruled Portugal with the calm confidence of a man who believed in absolute order. His Estado Novo new state wasn't flashy. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and ruthless. From 1932 to 1968, Salazar maintained an authoritarian grip over Portugal that prized hierarchy, nationalism, and Catholic values. His rule was defined by censorship, corporatism, and an intense fear of communism. The regime outlawed strikes, banned political parties, and placed strict controls on media. But behind this orderly facade operated the Pied Portugal's secret police. Pied functioned like a state within the state. Its agents infiltrated universities, unions, and churches. They monitored conversations, opened mail, and ran a sprawling network of informants. Those suspected of anti-regime activity were arrested, interrogated, and, often, tortured. Nowhere was this more infamous than Tarrafal, a prison camp on the island of Cape Verde, initially created in the 1932 to house political prisoners. It was dubbed the Camp of the Slow Death. Conditions were harsh. Inmates were isolated, beaten, and denied medical care. Many died from neglect, others from direct abuse. Tarrafal was Salazar's answer to resistance. A place so far removed, so brutal, it erased people from memory as well as society. Salazar's dictatorship lasted longer than most in Europe, in part due to Portugal's geographic and political isolation. Even as Western Europe modernized, Portugal lagged behind. Colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau drained the economy and radicalized a new generation, but Salazar held firm. After a stroke in 1968, Salazar was quietly removed from power, replaced by Marcelo Caetano. Yet even in his final years, he believed he still ruled, so complete was the control he had wielded. And after his death, the regime stumbled on until 1974, when a military coup ended the Estado Novo. But the transition didn't erase the memories of Pied's knock at the door or Tarrafal's cold walls. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, another dictator had used the chaos of World War II to orchestrate his own brand of terror, leading a fascist regime that left a stain of blood across Romania's wartime history. Ion Antonescu. Romania's wartime regime carried out mass murder and deportations of Jews to Transnistria. Ion Antonescu's Romania didn't just collaborate with Nazi Germany, it participated. Appointed as the country's conductor in 1940, Antonescu allied with Hitler and plunged Romania into World War II on the Axis side. But military campaigns were only part of the story. Behind the front lines, a different war was being waged against Romania's Jewish population. Antonescu's regime orchestrated mass deportations of Jews, particularly from the regions of Bessarabia and Bukovina. Entire communities were uprooted and forced onto trains, trucks, or marched on foot to the region of Transnistria, a stretch of occupied territory between the Dniester and Bug rivers. There, tens of thousands were abandoned to starvation, disease, and exposure. Many were murdered outright. Unlike the industrialized killing machines in Nazi-occupied Poland, the massacres in Romania were raw and disorganized, but no less deadly. Pogroms erupted in cities like Iași, where Romanian soldiers and civilians alike participated in the mass killing of Jews, often with horrific fervor. Antonescu was not a passive observer. He gave orders, approved operations, and shaped policies that led to the deaths of over 200,000 Jews. Even within Germany's own ranks, some were shocked by the brutality. Antonescu's government carried out its extermination policies with a mix of chaos and cruelty. And while he occasionally halted some deportations later in the war, largely for strategic reasons, his legacy was already cemented. When the tide of war turned and Soviet forces approached, Antonescu was overthrown in a royal coup. He was tried and executed in 1946. His name remains synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in Romanian history. Unlike other fascist leaders of the era, Antonescu's memory has remained deeply divisive in Romania. Some still regard him as a nationalist, but the evidence speaks louder. Under his rule, genocide was state policy. And just across the Adriatic, another dictator was building a paranoid fortress of his own, where isolation was policy, purges were frequent, and the walls of Albania echoed with silence. Enver Hoxha Albania's Stalinist dictatorship used labor camps and purges to isolate an entire nation. Enver Hoxha didn't just build a dictatorship, he buried a country inside one. Ruling Albania from the end of World War II until his death in 1985, Hoxha created one of the most isolated, paranoid regimes in modern European history. The outside world was not just suspicious, it was the enemy. And within, fear replaced faith. Hoxha modeled his government on Stalin's USSR, embracing purges, labor camps, and total ideological control. He executed or imprisoned political rivals, including many of his earliest allies. Accusations of revisionism or bourgeois thinking could lead to decades in prison, or worse. Loyalty was not enough. Only unwavering, performative allegiance to the party kept you safe. Entire families could be punished for the words of one member. Children of alleged traitors were barred from universities. Citizens were encouraged to report on one another. A network of informants ensured that privacy was non-existent. Labor camps dotted the Albanian countryside, grim facilities where prisoners toiled in mines, fields, and construction projects under brutal conditions. Many were political prisoners. Others were religious leaders, teachers, or anyone suspected of having Western sympathies. Religion itself was declared illegal in 1967, making Albania the first officially atheist state. Churches, mosques, and monasteries were closed or repurposed. Clergy were arrested. Even private expressions of faith became acts of resistance. International alliances came and went. Hoxha first aligned with Stalin, then with Mao's China, but every alliance eventually ended in betrayal and denunciation. By the late 1972, Albania was diplomatically alone. Its citizens couldn't leave. Foreign broadcasts were jammed. Western culture was banned. The regime invested in paranoia. Hoxha built over 170,000 concrete bunkers across the country, expecting imminent invasion. These bunkers, useless militarily, stand today as relics of a government at war with its own shadow. After Hoxha's death, the regime limped on, but the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe soon pulled Albania into chaos. What he left behind was a nation unprepared for the world it had been walled off from. And while Hoxha's brand of totalitarianism lived in silence, the next Nicolae Ceausescu, Decree 770's abortion ban helped fill grim orphanages and caused maternal deaths. Nicolae Ceausescu wanted more Romanians, more workers, more soldiers, more citizens to fuel his vision of a self-sufficient industrial utopia. And in 1966, he signed Decree 770, one of the most invasive population policies in modern history. It banned abortion and severely restricted access to contraception. The result? A demographic surge and a humanitarian disaster. Women were forced to undergo monthly gynecological exams at their workplaces. Doctors who performed illegal abortions faced prison. So did women who sought them. Even miscarriages were treated with suspicion. The state's control extended into the most personal corners of life. Initially, birth rates soared, but reality hit fast. Many families could not afford to raise 5, 6, or more children. Poverty deepened, healthcare systems strained. Maternal mortality spiked as women resorted to unsafe procedures. Thousands died. Unable to care for so many children, many parents abandoned them. The state responded by expanding its orphanage system. These weren't havens, they were warehouses. Overcrowded, underfunded, and neglected, these institutions became symbols of Ceausescu's failure. Children lived in filth, chained to beds, starved of affection and education. Some never learned to speak. Meanwhile, Ceausescu basked in his image. He built a cult of personality that rivaled North Korea's. He was the genius of the Carpathians, the Danube of thought. His speeches were televised endlessly. His wife, Elena, was elevated as a scientific genius. Dissent was silenced. The Securitate, his secret police, kept millions under surveillance. Informants were everywhere. While people stood in breadlines, the regime built the Palace of the Parliament, one of the largest and most expensive buildings in the world. Ceausescu's obsession with grandeur came at the cost of national misery. By 1989, as revolutions swept Eastern Europe, Romania erupted. Protesters flooded the streets. The regime ordered violence, but the military defected. Ceausescu and Elena fled briefly. They were captured, tried, and executed on live television. Decree 770 was repealed, but its impact lingers. Generations of Romanians grew up in the shadow of those orphanages, those silences, those betrayals. And as Ceausescu's body fell, another dictator faced his own reckoning, not in revolution, but in courtrooms. A Balkan strongman whose nationalist ambitions fueled wars, cleansings, and indictments from the world's highest tribunal. Slobodan Milošević, first sitting head of state, indicted by an international tribunal for crimes in Kosovo, Bosnia, Croatia. Slobodan Milošević rose to power in Yugoslavia on a wave of nationalism. At a time when the multi-ethnic federation was fraying, he leaned into identity politics, stoking ethnic tensions and promising to defend Serbs everywhere. What followed was a decade of war, siege, and state-sanctioned atrocities. As Yugoslavia dissolved in the early 1992, Milošević positioned himself as the protector of Serbs in Croatia, Bosnia, and later Kosovo. But protection came with a cost. His government provided political backing, weapons, and logistical support to paramilitary groups and breakaway factions. The results were horrifying: ethnic cleansing, mass displacement, and systematic violence against civilians. In Bosnia, entire villages were emptied. In Croatia, cities were shelled into rubble. In Kosovo, Serbian forces carried out a brutal crackdown on ethnic Albanians. Under Milosevic's rule, state media spread propaganda, portraying Serbs as victims surrounded by enemies. The truth was far more complex and bloodier. What made Milosevic's case unique was not just the scale of the violence, but the audacity of denying it while it was being documented. International journalists, satellite imagery, survivor testimonies all painted a damning picture. But inside Serbia, Milosevic maintained support through fear, control, and nationalist myth-making. In 1999, NATO intervened in Kosovo after failed diplomacy. Bombs fell on Belgrade, the war ended, and Milosevic's grip weakened. By 2000, massive protests and electoral fraud finally forced him from power. In a historic turn, he was arrested and extradited to The Hague. There, at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, he faced charges of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. He represented himself, using the courtroom as a stage for political theater. Milosevic died in custody in 2006 before a verdict was reached. But his trial set a precedent. A sitting or former head of state could be held accountable not by mobs, but by judges. Justice didn't always move quickly, but it moved. And from the Balkans to the Andes, another man ruled with medals on his chest and secret police at his back, leaving a trail of tortured silence and a nation forever haunted by its own shadows.
James I of Scotland, 1437, stabbed repeatedly by assassins while trapped near a blocked latrine conduit. James I of Scotland ruled with the kind of determination you'd expect from someone who had spent nearly 2 decades in English captivity. Captured as a child and held for ransom, he returned to Scotland in 1424 as a man forged in exile, a king with something to prove. And prove it he did. He launched reforms, strengthened the crown, broke the power of overreaching nobles, and tried to modernize the medieval tangle that was Scottish governance. He built a centralized court, tightened royal finances, and even dabbled in literature. He was every inch a Renaissance ruler, except that he lived in a kingdom still ruled by the sword. His reforms made enemies, lots of them. Chief among them were members of the powerful Albany Stuarts, a branch of his own extended family. They had effectively ruled Scotland during his absence and weren't thrilled about relinquishing that control. The ringleader was Sir Robert Graham, a former royal insider turned conspirator. In February 1437, James was staying at the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth with his queen, Joan Beaufort. He had few guards, and his enemies knew it. On the night of the 20th, Graham and his men struck. James heard the commotion and tried to flee. He attempted to escape through a secret tunnel connected to the latrines, an old waste conduit. But in a cruel twist of fate, the passage had recently been blocked with stone to keep tennis balls from rolling in. Trapped, cornered in a chamber, with nowhere left to run, the king fought back with anything he could grab. but the assassins overwhelmed him. They stabbed him more than a dozen times. He died in a puddle of panic and futility, surrounded by shadows. The Queen survived. She tracked down and punished the killers with brutal efficiency. Graham was captured, tortured, and executed, but the damage had been done. James I's death wasn't just a murder, it was an act of medieval revenge, a final punctuation mark on the sentence he had tried to rewrite. He had ruled for 13 years, reformed everything but fate, died not in battle, not in court, but trying to flee through a blocked sewer line. And if that's not poetic enough, wait until the next Scottish king whose death came not from blades or betrayal, but from standing too close to his own pride and canon.
Jorge Rafael Videla, Argentina's junta, disappeared tens of thousands during the Dirty War. Jorge Rafael Videla didn't declare war in the traditional sense, but when he led a military coup in Argentina in 1976, he began what would become one of the darkest episodes in Latin American history, a war not against another nation, but against his own people. The junta he led targeted political activists, union leaders, students, intellectuals, and anyone remotely connected to leftist ideology. The goal wasn't just control, it was erasure. The term disappeared became a chilling euphemism. People were taken from homes, buses, cafes. Many were never seen again. The regime operated a secret network of detention centers where torture, interrogation, and execution became routine. Prisoners were often drugged and thrown from airplanes into the ocean. Records were not kept or were destroyed. Families were left searching for decades, holding up photos of loved ones, asking questions no one would answer. The Dirty War was both systematic and arbitrary. Guilt was assumed. Trials were absent. Informants were everywhere. Fear saturated public life. And while the regime claimed it was defending Argentina from terrorism, it was committing terror itself. One of the most horrifying aspects was the kidnapping of pregnant detainees. Women gave birth in captivity, and their babies were taken adopted by military families or sold. The mothers were then killed. These stolen children grew up not knowing who they were. Years later, organizations like the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo would work tirelessly to reunite them with their real families. Videla governed until 1981, but the junta remained in power until 1983, when it collapsed in the wake of Argentina's disastrous war with the United Kingdom over the Falkland Islands. Democracy returned, but justice was slow. Videla was initially pardoned, then retried and convicted decades later. In 2010, he was sentenced to life in prison for crimes against humanity. He died behind bars in 2013, leaving behind a nation still grappling with how to remember a time when neighbors vanished and silence became survival. And from the plains of Argentina, we move north to a Caribbean strongman who painted his name in violence and ruled through fear so pervasive it crossed national borders and even languages. Rafael Trujillo ordered the 1937 Parsley Massacre, slaughtering thousands of Haitians at the border. Rafael Trujillo's rule over the Dominican Republic spanned 3 decades, but the shadow it cast remains longer still. He turned the country into his personal fiefdom, stamping his name on cities, monuments, and even the capital itself. Streets bore his image, schools taught his greatness, and when he issued orders, they were carried out with terrifying precision. In 1937, that precision became a massacre. Tensions between Dominicans and Haitians had long simmered along the border. Trujillo, driven by nationalism and racism, decided to solve the so-called Haitian problem. He ordered the military to eliminate Haitians living in the Dominican borderlands. What followed was the Parsley Massacre. Troops were sent into border villages. They asked residents to pronounce the word perejil, Spanish for parsley. Those who couldn't roll the R properly were presumed Haitian. It was a linguistic test turned death sentence. Over the course of a few days, an estimated 12,000 to 20,000 Haitians were killed. Many were hacked to death with machetes, a deliberate choice to make the violence seem like a local dispute rather than a state-organized operation. Trujillo later paid a nominal reparations fee to the Haitian government, but never acknowledged guilt. This wasn't an anomaly. Trujillo's rule was built on fear and control. Political opponents were assassinated, at home and abroad. Civil liberties were non-existent. The press was muzzled. Surveillance was everywhere. Yet he maintained a public image of order and modernization. He invested in infrastructure and education, but always with his name at the top of every project. The country functioned, but as an extension of one man's ego. Trujillo was finally assassinated in 1961, ambushed by a group of dissidents. His death cracked open a political vacuum and exposed the rot beneath the surface of his authoritarian glamour. What he left behind was a legacy of brutality wrapped in discipline, a regime that believed efficiency and cruelty could coexist, and a border still haunted by a single word: parsley. And south of the Dominican Republic, another dictator ruled with a similar combination of fear and longevity, one who used disappearances and regional alliances to hold an entire nation in stasis for decades. Alfredo Stroessner Paraguay, under his rule, featured torture, disappearances, and Operation Condor collaboration. Alfredo Stroessner governed Paraguay for 35 years, the longest uninterrupted dictatorship in South American history. His regime blended military rigidity, Cold War opportunism, and a sprawling surveillance apparatus into a stable but suffocating political environment. Elections were held, but they weren't fair. Opposition was allowed, but rarely survived, and the illusion of calm masked a deeply repressive state. Rising to power through a military coup in 1954, Stroessner promised order and anti-communism. The United States, seeking allies during the Cold War, backed him early on. In return, Stroessner delivered strict control over his country and total loyalty to U.S. geopolitical interests. But internally, that control came with a price. Paraguay under Stroessner was a police state. The secret police, known as the DNAT, monitored citizens, detained critics, and tortured prisoners in clandestine facilities. Journalists, union leaders, students, anyone deemed a threat could be arrested without cause. Many were never heard from again. His regime became a key participant in Operation Condor, a coordinated campaign of repression among South American dictatorships in the 1972nd and 1982nd. Together with Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil, Stroessner's government helped target political exiles across borders, abducting and executing them with shared intelligence and cooperation. At home, Stroessner maintained power through fear and patronage. His Colorado party dominated politics. State resources were funneled into loyal hands. Corruption thrived behind a facade of order. And Stroessner himself lived comfortably in the capital, distant from the suffering his rule created. In 1989, after decades of control, his regime fell to a coup led by one of his own generals. Stroessner fled to Brazil, where he lived in quiet exile until his death in 2006, never facing trial for the crimes committed under his rule. And while Stroessner governed through longevity and Cold War alliances, the next man on our list held power briefly, but his impact was brutal, immediate, and eventually led to a historic conviction for genocide. Efraín Ríos Montt. Guatemalan court found him guilty, 2013, of genocide against the Maya Ixil, verdict later annulled on technicality. General Efraín Ríos Montt ruled Guatemala for just over a year, from 1982 to 1983, but the devastation he left behind would echo for generations. His tenure came during the bloodiest phase of Guatemala's 36-year civil war, a conflict marked by military repression, leftist insurgency, and deep-rooted ethnic tension. Ríos Montt came to power via a military coup. His platform? Eliminate guerrillas and restore order. But his methods turned the highlands into killing fields. He implemented a scorched earth strategy that disproportionately targeted indigenous Maya Ixil communities, accusing them of harboring or sympathizing with rebels. Entire villages were razed. Civilians, men, women, and children were killed. Survivors were displaced into militarized model villages, where life was controlled and monitored. The campaign aimed not just at defeating insurgents, but at eradicating the cultural and communal structures that supported them. It was war reframed as annihilation. International observers raised alarms. Human rights groups documented atrocities, but the Reagan administration in the U.S. offered praise, calling Ríos Montt a man of integrity in a difficult region. His regime remained insulated by Cold War politics, and accountability seemed far off. Decades later, the tables turned. In 2013, at the age of 86, Ríos Montt was convicted in a Guatemalan court for genocide and crimes against humanity. It was the first time a former head of state had been convicted of genocide by a national court. The moment was historic, a signal that even decades-old crimes could be judged. And then, just 10 days later, the verdict was annulled on procedural grounds. A retrial was ordered. Ríos Montt died in 2018, before it could conclude. The legal twists did not erase the truth. The atrocities happened. Communities were destroyed. Survivors still live with the memory, and many still await justice. From the mountains of Guatemala, we shift to Central Asia, where another authoritarian leader ruled with a mix of cultish control and state violence, one who silenced protest with live rounds and buried accountability under a pile of denials.